On November 13th, 1312, within the stone walls of Windsor Castle, Queen Isabella of France gave birth to a son who would fundamentally reshape the course of English and European history. The infant prince, named Edward after his father, entered a world already marked by political instability and dynastic uncertainty. His birth occurred during one of the most turbulent periods of medieval English kingship, as Edward II's reign had already begun to fracture under the weight of military defeats, baronial opposition, and the king's controversial relationship with Piers Gaveston. The circumstances surrounding the future Edward III's early years were shaped by the profound dysfunction within the royal household. Edward II, who had ascended to the throne in 1307, had proven himself spectacularly unsuited to medieval kingship. His obsessive attachment to favourites, first Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, had alienated the English nobility and created a climate of perpetual crisis. The king's military incompetence had been brutally exposed at Bannockburn in 1314, where Scottish forces under Robert the Bruce had inflicted a devastating defeat on the English army, effectively securing Scottish independence and humiliating the English crown. Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV of France, had married Edward II in 1308 as part of a diplomatic alliance between the two kingdoms. Initially, the marriage appeared politically advantageous, but Isabella's position became increasingly precarious as her husband's attention remained fixated on his male favourites. The Queen's isolation within her own court profoundly influenced her relationship with her eldest son, as she recognised that young Edward represented not only her dynastic future, but potentially the salvation of the English monarchy itself. The prince's childhood unfolded against this backdrop of royal dysfunction and political crisis. Windsor Castle, where Edward spent his earliest years, served as both fortress and royal residence, its massive walls providing physical security while the political storms raged beyond. The castle's great hall, with its soaring timber roof and heraldic banners, became the young prince's first classroom in the pageantry of medieval kingship. Here he observed the rituals of court life, the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded royal authority, and the careful choreography of noble interaction that defined medieval political culture. Isabella's influence on her son's early development cannot be overstated. As the daughter of one of Europe's most successful monarchs, she possessed an intimate understanding of effective royal governance that her husband conspicuously lacked. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, had expanded royal authority, centralised administrative power, and successfully challenged the papacy during the Avignon crisis. Isabella had witnessed firsthand how a strong monarch could dominate both nobility and church, lessons she would impart to her son through careful observation of her father's methods. The Queen's relationship with Edward II deteriorated steadily throughout the prince's childhood. The king's favouritism toward Hugh Despenser the Younger had reached scandalous proportions by the early 1320s, with the royal favourite accumulating vast estates and exercising authority that properly belonged to established nobles. Isabella found herself marginalised within her own household, her income restricted, her French attendance dismissed, and her political influence systematically undermined. This personal humiliation transformed the French princess into a formidable political opponent, one who would eventually orchestrate her husband's downfall. Young Edward's education reflected the complex political realities of his position. His tutors included some of the most learned men in England, who provided instruction in Latin, French, mathematics, and the classical texts that form the foundation of medieval education. Richard de Berry, who would later serve as the prince's treasurer and become one of England's most notable bibliophiles, played a crucial role in developing Edward's intellectual capabilities. Under Berry's guidance, the prince acquired not only literacy in multiple languages, but also an appreciation for the administrative complexities of medieval governance. Military training formed an equally important component of the prince's education. Medieval kingship demanded personal prowess in warfare, and Edward's instructors ensured he mastered the essential skills of knighthood. He learned swordsmanship, horsemanship, and the tactical principles that governed medieval battlefield combat. The great courtyard of Windsor Castle became his training ground, where he practiced mounted combat techniques and developed the physical strength necessary for wielding medieval weapons effectively. His instructors emphasized the importance of personal courage in battle, as medieval kings were expected to lead their armies from the front, sharing the dangers faced by their soldiers. The chivalric ideals that would later define Edward's reign were instilled during these formative years. His tutors emphasized the knightly virtues of courage, honour, courtesy, and protection of the weak, while also providing practical instruction in the realities of medieval warfare. The prince learned about siege techniques, the deployment of different military units, and the logistical challenges involved in maintaining armies in the field. These lessons would prove invaluable during his later campaigns in Scotland and France, where his tactical innovations would revolutionize medieval military practice. The political crisis that would ultimately bring Edward to power began to intensify during the mid-1320s. The Despencer regime had become increasingly oppressive, with Hugh Despencer the Younger using his influence over Edward II to pursue a systematic campaign of land confiscation and political persecution. The king's behaviour had become so erratic and his government so dysfunctional that even traditionally, loyal nobles began to question the sustainability of his rule. The execution of Thomas of Lancaster in 1322, following his rebellion against the Despensers, had eliminated the most prominent opposition leader but had failed to resolve the underlying political crisis. Isabella's transformation from neglected queen to active conspirator occurred gradually during this period. Her brother Charles IV's succession to the French throne in 1322 provided her with a powerful ally, while her growing alienation from her husband created both motive and opportunity for political action. The Queen began cultivating relationships with disaffected English nobles, many of whom had suffered under the Despencer regime and were eager for an alternative to Edward II's continued rule. The diplomatic crisis that would provide Isabella with her opportunity arose from the complex feudal relationship between England and France regarding Gascony. As Duke of Aquitaine, Edward II owed homage to the French king for his continental territories, but the English king's reluctance to perform this ceremony in person created ongoing tensions between the two kingdoms. When Charles IV threatened military action against English holdings in France, Isabella proposed a solution that would place her at the centre of European diplomacy. In 1325, Isabella departed for France ostensibly to negotiate a settlement of the Gascon crisis. Her real purpose, however, was to establish the foundation for an invasion of England that would remove her husband from power. The Queen's diplomatic mission provided perfect cover for her conspiratorial activities, as she could meet with potential allies under the guise of conducting legitimate royal business. Her son Edward, now 13 years old, remained in England, unaware that his mother was orchestrating a revolution that would fundamentally alter his destiny. The prince's position became increasingly precarious as tensions between his parents reached a breaking point. Edward II, perhaps sensing his wife's growing hostility, began to restrict her movements and monitor her correspondence. The king's paranoia extended to suspicions about his son's loyalty, creating an atmosphere of mutual distrust within the royal family. Young Edward found himself caught between conflicting loyalties, uncertain whether to support his father's increasingly unpopular regime or align himself with his mother's growing opposition movement. Isabella's alliance with Roger Mortimer, the exiled English noble who had escaped from the Tower of London in 1323, transformed her diplomatic mission into an active conspiracy against Edward II. Mortimer, a skilled military commander and experienced politician, provided the Queen with both strategic expertise and connections to other disaffected English nobles. Their relationship, which quickly became both political and personal, would dominate English politics for the next 4 years and profoundly influence the young prince's understanding of power and its exercise. The invasion preparations began in earnest during 1326, as Isabella and Mortimer assembled a coalition of English exiles, Flemish mercenaries, and French supporters. The Queen's brother initially provided cautious support for her activities, recognising that the removal of Edward II might advance French interests while avoiding direct military confrontation with England. The invasion force that eventually sailed from the Low Countries was relatively small, consisting of perhaps 1,500 men, but it represented a formidable political threat to a regime that had already lost the confidence of much of the English nobility. Young Edward's role in these events remained largely passive, though his symbolic importance was recognised by all parties. As heir to the throne, his support would legitimise any change of government, while his opposition could provide Edward II with a rallying point for resistance. The prince's political education accelerated rapidly during this period, as he observed the complex manoeuvring that preceded his mother's invasion, and began to understand the practical mechanics of medieval power politics. The invasion itself, launched in September 1326, met with remarkably little resistance. Isabella and Mortimer landed at Orwell in Suffolk and immediately began attracting support from nobles who had suffered under the dispenser regime. The Queen's propaganda emphasised her role as a wronged wife, seeking justice rather than as a foreign invader, a message that resonated with many English nobles who had grown tired of Edward II's misrule. The speed with which support materialised demonstrated the extent of the king's political isolation and the effectiveness of Isabella's preliminary negotiations. Edward II's response to the invasion proved characteristically ineffective. Rather than mobilising military resistance or attempting to negotiate with the rebels, the king fled westward with the dispensers, apparently hoping to find refuge in Wales or Ireland. This flight abandoned London to the invaders and allowed Isabella to present herself as the legitimate representative of royal authority. The prince, who had been left in London, found himself effectively in his mother's custody, though the exact circumstances of their reunion remain unclear from contemporary sources. The collapse of Edward II's regime occurred with stunning rapidity. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured and executed at Bristol in October 1326, while his son met the same fate at Hereford in November. Edward II himself was taken prisoner in Wales and confined at Kenilworth Castle under the custody of his cousin Henry of Lancaster. The king's capture effectively ended organised resistance to Isabella's regime, though the legal and constitutional questions surrounding his deposition remained to be resolved. The young prince's position during these dramatic events was both crucial and precarious. As the legitimate heir to the throne, his cooperation was essential for any constitutional settlement, yet his youth and inexperience made him vulnerable to manipulation by the adults who now controlled the government. Isabella and Mortimer recognised that their authority ultimately depended on the prince's eventual succession, but they also needed to maintain control over the transition process to secure their own positions. The deposition of Edward II required careful legal and political manoeuvring to maintain the appearance of constitutional legitimacy. The Parliament that convened in January 1327 faced the unprecedented task of removing a crowned king while preserving the principle of hereditary monarchy. The solution involved forcing Edward II to abdicate in favour of his son, a process that required the prince's formal acceptance of the crown while ensuring that real power remained in the hands of Isabella and Mortimer. The coronation of Edward III on February 1, 1327 at Westminster Abbey marked a pivotal moment in English royal history, yet the ceremony itself revealed the precarious nature of the new king's position. At 14 years old, Edward stood before the assembled nobility, clergy and commons as the youngest monarch to be crowned in over 2 centuries. The Gothic splendour of Westminster Abbey, with its soaring-ribbed vaults and jewel-toned stained-glass windows casting coloured light across the ancient stones, provided a magnificent backdrop for the ancient rituals of kingship. Archbishop Walter Reynolds of Canterbury performed the consecration, anointing the young king with holy oil and placing the crown of St. Edward upon his head. but the true power behind the throne remained firmly in the hands of his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. The Regency Council, established to govern during Edward's minority, reflected the political realities that had brought the new regime to power. Isabella assumed the title of Queen Mother and positioned herself as the primary regent, while Mortimer, though lacking any formal constitutional role, exercised enormous influence over governmental decisions. The council included several prominent nobles who had supported the invasion of 1326, including Henry of Lancaster, the king's great-uncle, and Thomas Wake, both of whom had suffered under the previous regime. However, the distribution of real authority remained heavily concentrated in the hands of Isabella and Mortimer, who controlled access to the young king and dominated the administrative machinery of government. The physical arrangements at court emphasised Edward's subordinate position within his own kingdom. At Westminster Palace, the king occupied the royal apartments, but his movements were carefully monitored and his access to independent counsel severely restricted. Mortimer had established himself in chambers adjacent to the royal quarters, allowing him to control who could meet with Edward and what information reached the young monarch. The Great Hall of Westminster, where the king held formal audiences, became a stage for carefully orchestrated displays of royal authority, with Edward performing the ceremonial functions of kingship, while the substantive decisions were made elsewhere by his regents. The financial arrangements of the new regime revealed the extent to which royal prerogatives had been transferred to the Regency Council. The royal treasury, depleted by years of mismanagement under Edward II, and the costs of the recent political upheaval, required careful administration to meet the government's obligations. Isabella and Mortimer assumed control over royal revenues, including the lucrative customs duties on wool exports that formed the backbone of English royal finance. The young king received a household allowance sufficient to maintain the dignity of his position, but he possessed no independent access to the resources necessary for autonomous political action. Marriage negotiations for the teenage king began almost immediately after his coronation, reflecting both diplomatic necessity and the regent's desire to secure their position through advantageous foreign alliances. The political situation in Europe during 1327 presented both opportunities and challenges for English diplomacy. France remained technically at war with England over the Gascon territories, while Scotland continued to assert its independence under Robert the Bruce. The Low Countries, with their crucial wool trade connections to England, offered potential allies who might counterbalance French power, but these relationships required careful cultivation through matrimonial diplomacy. The selection of Philippa of Hainault as Edward's prospective bride demonstrated the regent's sophisticated understanding of continental politics. Count William of Hainault had provided crucial support for Isabella's invasion in 1326, offering both financial backing and military assistance that had proven essential to the success of the enterprise. His daughter Philippa, born around 1314, represented an ideal diplomatic match that would cement the alliance between England and the Low Countries, while providing the English crown with connections to the complex web of noble relationships that dominated northern European politics. The proxy marriage ceremony, conducted at York Minster in October 1327, followed established protocols for royal matrimonial alliances, while the bride remained in her father's territories. The magnificent Gothic cathedral, with its elaborate stone tracery and towering central tower, provided an appropriately grand setting for the ceremony that would unite two of Europe's most significant noble houses. Bishop William Melton of York officiated at the service, with Jean de Hainault, Philippa's uncle, standing as proxy for the absent bride. Edward, now 15, participated in the ceremony with apparent dignity, though contemporary observers noted his reserved demeanour throughout the proceedings. The diplomatic significance of this marriage alliance extended far beyond the immediate benefits to English foreign policy. The House of Hainault maintained extensive connections throughout the Holy Roman Empire, including relationships with the powerful Counts of Flanders and the emerging Burgundian nobility. These connections would prove invaluable in the coming decades, as Edward developed his claims to the French throne and sought to build coalitions against Valois France. The marriage also provided England with potential access to Flemish military expertise, particularly in the development of infantry tactics that would revolutionise medieval warfare. However, the marriage negotiations also revealed growing tensions between the young king and his regents over the fundamental question of royal prerogatives. Edward had begun to assert his own preferences regarding the selection of his bride, initially showing interest in a Spanish alliance that would have provided different strategic advantages. Isabella and Mortimer overruled these preferences, insisting that the Hainault match better served English interests. But their high-handed approach created resentment that would fester over the following years. The king's private conversations with trusted advisers, carefully monitored by Mortimer's agents, revealed his growing frustration with his subordinate position. The actual arrival of Philippa in England in December 1327 marked another significant milestone in Edward's personal development and political education. The young queen, accompanied by a substantial retinue of Flemish nobles and attendants, brought with her not only the diplomatic benefits of the alliance, but also exposure to different approaches to governance and court culture. Her household included experienced administrators who had served the counts of Hainault, providing Edward with alternative models of royal authority that contrasted sharply with the regency arrangement under which he currently lived. The formal wedding ceremony at York Minster in January 1328 demonstrated both the splendour of medieval royal matrimony and the continuing dominance of Isabella and Mortimer over royal policy. The cathedral, illuminated by hundreds of candles and decorated with rich tapestries bearing the arms of England and Hainault, hosted one of the most magnificent celebrations of Edward's early reign. Archbishop Melton performed the nuptial mass, blessing the union between the 15-year-old king and his slightly younger bride. The wedding feast that followed showcased the wealth and sophistication of the English court, with elaborate courses of roasted meats, exotic spices, and entertainment provided by minstrels and acrobats. Yet beneath the ceremonial magnificence, political tensions continued to simmer between Edward and his regents. The king's marriage had provided him with a potential ally in his wife, whose foreign birth and independent household offered possibilities for developing autonomous sources of advice and support. Philippa's presence at court also attracted Flemish nobles and merchants whose interests did not necessarily align with those of Isabella and Mortimer, creating new dynamics within the royal council that the regents found increasingly difficult to control. The Scottish campaign of 1327 provided the first major test of the regency's military capabilities and revealed fundamental weaknesses in their approach to governance. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, negotiated in the aftermath of the failed Weardale campaign, effectively recognised Scottish independence and abandoned English claims to overlordship that had been maintained since the reign of Edward I. This diplomatic surrender proved deeply unpopular with the English nobility, many of whom had lost lands in Scotland during the Wars of Independence and viewed the treaty as a betrayal of their interests. Edward's role during the Scottish negotiations highlighted his growing political maturity and his increasing dissatisfaction with the regency's policies. Contemporary chronicles suggest that the young king opposed the treaty terms, particularly the recognition of Robert the Bruce's royal title and the abandonment of English territorial claims. However, his protests were overruled by Isabella and Mortimer, who prioritised the consolidation of their domestic position over the pursuit of expensive and potentially unsuccessful military campaigns in Scotland. The financial costs of the Scottish campaign and the subsequent diplomatic settlement created additional strains within the Regency government. The expedition had required substantial expenditures for military preparations, including the recruitment of mercenary forces and the purchase of supplies and equipment. The failure to achieve meaningful military objectives meant that these costs could not be offset by the acquisition of Scottish territories or tribute payments, placing additional pressure on royal finances that were already stretched by the expenses of maintaining the court and administering the kingdom. By 1329, Edward's frustration with his subordinate position had begun to manifest in more direct challenges to the regency's authority. The king, now 17 years old and increasingly confident in his own abilities, began to assert his right to participate in governmental decisions and to receive independent counsel from advisers of his own choosing. His marriage to Philippa had provided him with a household that included individuals whose primary loyalty was to the crown, rather than to Isabella and Mortimer, creating the foundation for an alternative power structure within the royal court. The birth of Edward's first child, the future Edward the Black Prince, in June 1330, marked a crucial turning point in the young king's relationship with his regents. The arrival of an heir to the throne strengthened Edward's position significantly, as it ensured the continuation of the Plantagenet dynasty and reduced the regent's ability to threaten him with the possibility of alternative succession arrangements. The christening ceremony at Woodstock Palace, attended by the most prominent nobles of the realm, provided Edward with an opportunity to demonstrate his growing independence and to receive the homage of his subjects in his own right rather than as a ward of the Regency Council. The political crisis that would ultimately lead to Edward's seizure of power began to develop during the summer of 1330, as tensions over the distribution of authority within the government reached a breaking point. Mortimer's increasingly arrogant behaviour had alienated many of the nobles who had initially supported the regency, while his accumulation of titles and estates had created resentment among the established nobility. His assumption of the title Earl of March in 1328 had been viewed by many as presumptuous, particularly given his relatively modest origins and his dependence on the Queen's favour for his political position. The immediate catalyst for Edward's coup arose from disputes over the appointment of royal officials and the distribution of patronage within the government. The young king had begun to assert his right to select his own advisers and to reward those who served him loyally. But these preferences frequently conflicted with the regent's desire to maintain control over the administrative machinery of government. When Edward attempted to appoint William Montagu to a position within the royal household, Mortimer's opposition created a direct confrontation over the fundamental question of royal authority. The planning for the coup at Nottingham Castle required careful coordination between Edward and a small group of trusted supporters who shared his determination to end the regency. William Montagu, Edward Bohun and Robert Ufford formed the core of the conspiracy, providing the king with both military expertise and connections to other disaffected nobles who might support a change of government. The selection of Nottingham Castle as the location for the decisive action reflected both practical and symbolic considerations, as the fortress provided a secure location for the court, while its historical associations with royal authority emphasised the legitimacy of Edward's actions. The dramatic events of October 19th, 1330, unfolded with remarkable precision and demonstrated Edward's growing political sophistication. The conspirators gained access to the castle through a secret passage that bypassed Mortimer's guards, allowing them to reach the royal apartments without detection. The confrontation between Edward and Mortimer in the Queen's chambers marked the definitive end of the Regency period, as the young king personally ordered the arrest of the man who had dominated English politics for nearly 4 years. Isabella's desperate pleas for mercy for her lover revealed the extent to which personal relationships had become intertwined with political power during the Regency period, but Edward's determination to assert his authority brooked no compromise. The immediate aftermath of Mortimer's arrest saw Edward move swiftly to consolidate his control over the government and to demonstrate his capacity for independent rule. The establishment of a new royal council dominated by nobles who had supported the coup signalled the beginning of a new phase in English politics characterised by the king's personal involvement in governmental decisions. The speed and efficiency with which Edward assumed control of the administrative machinery demonstrated both his political maturity and the extent to which he had prepared for this moment during the preceding months of planning and conspiracy. The execution of Roger Mortimer at Tyburn on November 29, 1330, marked the definitive end of the Regency period and the beginning of Edward III's personal rule. The former Earl of March met his death with the same arrogance that had characterised his political career, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the charges against him, even as the executioner's noose tightened around his neck. The crowd that gathered to witness the spectacle included many nobles who had suffered under Mortimer's dominance, their presence serving as both validation of Edward's actions and warning to any who might challenge the young king's newly asserted authority. The gallows at Tyburn, situated at the junction of several major roads leading into London, provided maximum visibility for this demonstration of royal justice, ensuring that news of Mortimer's fate would spread rapidly throughout the kingdom. Edward's systematic dismantling of his mother's power structure began immediately following Mortimer's arrest, and continued throughout the winter of 1330 to 1331. The king's approach demonstrated remarkable political sophistication for an 18-year-old monarch, as he carefully distinguished between those who had actively supported the regency's oppressive policies and those who had merely served in administrative capacities. Isabella herself was confined to Castle Rising in Norfolk, a comfortable but isolated residence where she would remain under house arrest for the remainder of her life. The castle, with its impressive stone keep and defensive walls, provided adequate accommodation for a dowager queen while ensuring her complete removal from political influence. The redistribution of offices and estates that had been accumulated by Mortimer and his supporters required careful attention to both justice and political expediency. Edward recognised that excessive vindictiveness might alienate potential supporters, while insufficient action would suggest weakness and invite future challenges to his authority. The vast estates that Mortimer had acquired through royal favour were redistributed among nobles, who had demonstrated loyalty to the crown, with particular attention paid to compensating those who had suffered losses during the Regency period. The Earl of March's stronghold at Wigmore Castle in Herefordshire was granted to Edmund Mortimer, Roger's nephew, who had opposed his uncle's policies and supported Edward's coup. The restoration of royal dignity required immediate attention to the ceremonial and symbolic aspects of kingship that had been compromised during the Regency period. Edward ordered the renovation of royal residences that had fallen into disrepair, with particular emphasis on Westminster Palace and Windsor Castle, the two locations most closely associated with English royal authority. The Great Hall at Westminster received new tapestries depicting the achievements of previous English kings, while the royal apartments were refurbished with furnishings appropriate to Edward's enhanced status as an independent monarch. These improvements served both practical and propaganda purposes, demonstrating the crown's renewed financial stability, while providing impressive settings for the diplomatic receptions and court ceremonies that would characterise Edward's reign. The completion of marriage arrangements with Philippa of Hainault took on new significance following Edward's assumption of personal rule. The young queen, who had remained somewhat marginalised during the Regency period due to Isabella's dominance of court life, now emerged as a crucial figure in the establishment of Edward's royal household. Philippa's Flemish attendants and advisers, who had previously been viewed with suspicion by Mortimer's supporters, suddenly found themselves welcomed into positions of influence within the royal administration. The Queen's household became a centre for diplomatic activity, as her connections to the Low Countries provided Edward with valuable intelligence about continental political developments and potential alliance opportunities. The royal couple's residence at Windsor Castle underwent significant expansion during this period, as Edward sought to create a court environment that would reflect both his personal tastes and his political ambitions. The construction of new apartments within the castle's upper ward provided accommodation for the growing number of courtiers and foreign dignitaries who sought access to the newly independent monarch. The castle's round tower, which would later become the focal point of Edward's chivalric innovations, received particular attention during these renovations, with the addition of elaborate decorative elements that emphasised the Plantagenet dynasty's claims to both English and French royal heritage. Edward's domestic policies during his first years of personal rule focused primarily on legal reforms designed to restore confidence in royal justice and administrative efficiency. The corruption that had characterised many governmental departments during the Regency period required systematic attention, as Mortimer's supporters had frequently used their positions for personal enrichment at the expense of both the Crown and private litigants. The king established special commissions to investigate abuses in the courts of common law, with particular attention to cases where justice had been perverted through bribery or political influence. These investigations resulted in the dismissal of numerous officials and the implementation of new procedures designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The economic recovery that began during Edward's early personal rule reflected both improved governmental administration and the natural resilience of England's fundamentally sound economic foundations. The wool trade, which formed the backbone of English prosperity, had continued to flourish despite the political instability of the Regency period, providing the Crown with substantial customs revenues that could support both domestic improvements and foreign policy initiatives. Edward's government implemented new regulations governing the export of raw wool, ensuring that English merchants received fair treatment in continental markets while maximising royal revenues from customs duties and export licences. The restoration of royal dignity extended beyond ceremonial matters to include substantive reforms in the administration of justice and the conduct of governmental business. Edward established new procedures for the hearing of petitions in Parliament, ensuring that grievances from all levels of society could receive appropriate attention from royal officials. The king's personal involvement in judicial proceedings, while limited by the practical demands of governance, provided visible evidence of his commitment to fair and impartial justice. The Great Hall at Westminster became the setting for regular audiences where Edward received petitioners and demonstrated his accessibility to his subjects, a marked contrast to the secretive and exclusive practices that had characterised the Regency period. The military campaigns in Scotland that began in 1332 provided Edward with his first opportunity to demonstrate independent leadership in warfare and to begin the process of reversing the humiliating diplomatic concessions made during his minority. The Scottish succession crisis that followed the death of Robert the Bruce in 1329 created an opening for English intervention that Edward was eager to exploit. The young king's support for Edward Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne reflected both strategic calculation and personal determination to restore English influence north of the border. The Battle of Duplin Moor on August 11, 1332, though fought primarily by Balliol's supporters rather than royal forces, provided valuable intelligence about Scottish military capabilities and tactical preferences. The crushing defeat inflicted on the forces of the boy King David II demonstrated that Scottish military dominance was not inevitable, and that properly organised English forces could achieve decisive victories against their northern neighbours. Edward's careful analysis of the battle's tactical lessons would prove crucial in his subsequent military planning, as he recognised the importance of coordinated infantry and cavalry operations in achieving battlefield success. The formal renewal of English claims to Scottish overlordship required careful legal and diplomatic preparation to ensure maximum international legitimacy. Edward's government commissioned scholarly treatises examining the historical basis for English suzerainty over Scotland, drawing on precedents from the reigns of Edward I and earlier monarchs to construct compelling legal arguments. These documents served both domestic and international propaganda purposes, providing justification for military intervention while demonstrating the intellectual sophistication of Edward's court to foreign observers who might otherwise view English actions as mere territorial aggression. The Siege of Berwick in 1333 marked Edward's first personal involvement in major military operations and provided crucial experience in the practical challenges of medieval warfare. The town's strategic position on the border between England and Scotland made its control essential for any successful campaign north of the Tweed. while its strong fortifications and determined garrison presented formidable obstacles to English ambitions. Edward's decision to conduct the siege personally, rather than delegating command to subordinate officers, demonstrated both his commitment to military leadership and his recognition that royal presence was essential for maintaining troop morale during extended operations. The technical aspects of the siege revealed Edward's growing understanding of contemporary military engineering and his willingness to invest in the latest developments in siege warfare. The English forces employed a combination of traditional siege engines, including trebuchets and mangonels, alongside newer innovations such as early gunpowder weapons that were beginning to appear on European battlefields. The construction of elaborate siege works around Berwick's perimeter required substantial logistical organisation, as thousands of soldiers needed to be supplied with food, equipment and ammunition throughout the extended operation. The Battle of Halidon Hill on July 19, 1333, represented the culmination of Edward's Scottish campaign and provided decisive proof of his military capabilities. The English position on the hill's slopes offered significant tactical advantages, allowing Edward to deploy his forces in a defensive formation that maximised the effectiveness of his archers while minimising the impact of Scottish cavalry charges. The King's personal command of the Centre Division demonstrated his willingness to share the dangers faced by his soldiers, while his tactical dispositions revealed sophisticated understanding of battlefield dynamics that would characterise his later campaigns in France. The Scottish army that advanced against the English positions included many of the kingdom's most experienced military leaders, veterans of the Wars of Independence who had learned their craft under Robert the Bruce and James Douglas. Their confidence in traditional Scottish tactics, particularly the Schiltron formations that had proven effective at Bannockburn, blinded them to the tactical innovations that Edward had implemented in his army's organisation and equipment. The devastating effectiveness of English longbow fire against the advancing Scottish formations demonstrated the superiority of coordinated missile and melee combat over purely offensive tactics. The aftermath of Halidon Hill provided Edward with his first major diplomatic triumph and established his reputation as a formidable military commander throughout Europe. The Scottish casualties included many prominent nobles and military leaders, effectively decapitating the kingdom's military leadership and leaving David II's government unable to mount effective resistance to English occupation of southern Scotland. The restoration of Edward Balliol to the Scottish throne under English overlordship appeared to reverse the diplomatic humiliations of the Regency period and to restore English prestige in international affairs. The administrative challenges of governing occupied Scottish territories required the development of new governmental structures that could maintain English control while accommodating local customs and legal traditions. Edward's establishment of English garrisons in key Scottish castles provided military security for the occupation, while his appointment of English administrators to collect revenues and maintain order created the foundation for long-term political control. The integration of Scottish revenues into English governmental finances provided additional resources for future military campaigns while demonstrating the practical benefits of territorial expansion. The diplomatic ramifications of Edward's Scottish victories extended far beyond the immediate Anglo-Scottish relationship to influence the broader European political situation. The French government, which had maintained alliance relationships with Scotland since the late 13th century, found itself obligated to provide support for David II's exiled regime, while simultaneously managing its own complex relationship with England regarding Gascon territories. Edward's success in Scotland demonstrated English military resurgence and suggested that French assumptions about English weakness following the Regency period required fundamental reassessment. The development of Edward's continental ambitions during this period reflected both the confidence generated by his Scottish successes and his growing awareness of the opportunities presented by French political instability. The death of Charles IV of France in 1328 had created a succession crisis that would eventually provide Edward with the justification for his claims to the French throne, though the immediate priority remained the consolidation of his Scottish gains and the establishment of his reputation as an independent and effective monarch. The death of Charles IV of France on February 1st, 1328, had created a constitutional crisis that would ultimately provide Edward III with the legal foundation for his claims to the French throne. The last direct male heir of the Capetian dynasty, Charles left no male children, precipitating a succession dispute that would reshape European politics for more than a century. The French nobility, faced with the unprecedented situation of a royal succession without a direct male heir, convened to determine the rightful claimant to the throne. Their deliberations would ultimately exclude Edward III from consideration, despite his legitimate hereditary claim through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France. The legal complexities surrounding Edward's claim derived from the intricate web of feudal relationships and inheritance laws that governed medieval European monarchy. As the son of Isabella of France, Edward possessed an undeniable blood connection to the French royal house, representing the closest living male relative of the deceased Charles IV. However, the French nobility's interpretation of inheritance law, subsequently codified as the Salic law, explicitly excluded inheritance through the female line, arguing that women could neither inherit the crown nor transmit such rights to their male descendants. This interpretation, while convenient for French political interests, lacked clear precedent in earlier French succession practices and would remain a source of contention throughout the subsequent conflict. Philip of Valois, who assumed the French throne as Philip VI in 1328, represented a more distant but exclusively male line of descent from the Capetian dynasty. As the son of Charles of Valois, brother of Philip IV, the new French king could trace his lineage through an unbroken chain of male inheritance, satisfying the French nobility's preference for avoiding the complications of female succession. Philip's coronation at Reims Cathedral on May 29, 1328, followed traditional French ceremonial practices, with Archbishop Guillaume de Trie performing the ancient rituals that legitimize royal authority in the eyes of both French subjects and international observers. Edward's initial response to Philip VI's succession demonstrated remarkable diplomatic restraint, reflecting both his youth and his preoccupation with Scottish affairs. Rather than immediately pressing his theoretical claims to the French throne, Edward chose to acknowledge Philip's authority and to perform homage for his French territories as Duke of Aquitaine. This decision, while pragmatically sound given England's military commitments in Scotland, effectively recognised the legitimacy of the Valois succession and complicated any future assertions of English claims to French royal authority. The ceremony of homage performed at Amiens Cathedral on June 6, 1329, revealed the complex feudal relationships that bound the English and French crowns together despite their fundamental political rivalry. Edward, accompanied by a substantial retinue of English nobles, knelt before Philip VI in the cathedral's soaring Gothic nave and formally acknowledged his vassal status regarding his continental territories. The ritual, conducted according to centuries-old feudal protocols, required Edward to place his hands between those of the French king while reciting the traditional oath of loyalty and service. This public submission, while limited to Edward's capacity as Duke of Aquitaine rather than as King of England, created a legally binding relationship that would complicate future diplomatic relations between the two kingdoms. The territorial scope of Edward's French holdings encompassed substantial portions of southwestern France, including the Duchy of Aquitaine and the County of Ponthieu, inherited through his mother's lineage. These territories generated significant revenues through wine production, agricultural rents and commercial activities, making them economically valuable to the English crown while simultaneously creating ongoing administrative challenges. The governance of these distant territories required the maintenance of English officials in French castles. the collection of revenues through local administrative structures, and the resolution of legal disputes according to local customs that often conflicted with English legal traditions. The gradual deterioration of Anglo-French relations during the early 1330s reflected both Philip VI's growing confidence in his royal authority and Edward's increasing assertiveness following his successful Scottish campaigns. French interference in Scottish affairs, including financial support for David II's exiled government and diplomatic pressure on other European powers to oppose English occupation policies, created mounting tensions that threatened the fragile feudal relationship between the two monarchs. Philip's provision of sanctuary for Scottish nobles fleeing English justice directly challenged Edward's sovereignty over his conquered territories and suggested French willingness to support anti-English activities despite the formal feudal bonds between the two crowns. The immediate cause of the war's outbreak arose from Philip VI's decision to confiscate the Duchy of Gascony in May 1337, following Edward's refusal to extradite Robert of Artois, a French noble who had fled to England after being accused of treason by the French court. The confiscation decree issued from the royal palace at Vincennes declared Edward's French territories forfeit due to his failure to fulfil his feudal obligations as a vassal of the French crown. This action, while legally justified under feudal law, represented a direct challenge to English economic interests and territorial integrity that Edward could not ignore without appearing weak before his own nobility and European observers. Edward's response to the Gascon confiscation demonstrated both strategic calculation and careful attention to legal justifications for military action. Rather than immediately declaring war, the English king initially attempted diplomatic resolution through papal mediation and appeals to feudal law. However, these efforts proved unsuccessful as Philip VI remained determined to assert French royal authority over all territories within the kingdom's boundaries. The failure of diplomatic solutions forced Edward to consider military options, but the scale of the challenge required careful preparation and the development of strategic alliances that could counterbalance French military superiority. The formal assertion of Edward's claim to the French throne, announced in a letter dated October 7, 1337, transformed a feudal dispute over territorial rights into a dynastic war that would continue for generations. The document, composed by Edward's chancery clerks with input from legal scholars and diplomatic advisers, presented detailed arguments supporting English claims to French royal authority while simultaneously rejecting the legitimacy of Philip VI's rule. The letter's circulation throughout European courts served both propaganda and diplomatic purposes, seeking to establish international recognition for Edward's position while undermining Philip's claims to legitimate authority. The strategic challenge facing Edward in 1337 required the development of military capabilities sufficient to challenge French dominance on the continent, while simultaneously maintaining English control over Scotland and defending against potential French invasion of England itself. The English military establishment, while experienced in Scottish warfare, lacked the resources and organisational structure necessary for sustained continental campaigning against the most powerful kingdom in Europe. The development of these capabilities would require not only military innovation and recruitment, but also the establishment of diplomatic alliances that could provide both strategic support and alternative theatres of operation to divide French attention and resources. The formation of alliances with Flemish cities represented Edward's first major diplomatic success in building a continental coalition against France. The wealthy cloth-producing centres of Bruges, Ghent and Ypres possessed both the financial resources and the commercial interests necessary to support anti-French policies, as their economic prosperity depended heavily on continued access to English wool supplies. The complex urban politics of these Flemish communes, dominated by merchant guilds and craft associations, required careful diplomatic manoeuvring to secure their cooperation against their nominal French overlord. Jacob van Artevelde, the influential merchant leader who dominated Ghent's political life during this period, emerged as Edward's most important Flemish ally and the architect of the broader Flemish-English alliance. Van Artevelde's political position rested on his ability to maintain Ghent's economic prosperity through continued trade relationships with England, making him a natural opponent of French policies that threatened to disrupt these commercial connections. His negotiations with English diplomatic representatives during 1337 and 1338 established the framework for military cooperation that would provide Edward with crucial continental bases for his subsequent campaigns in France. The diplomatic mission to the Holy Roman Empire undertaken by Bishop John Stratford of Winchester in 1337 sought to establish alliance relationships with German princes who possessed both military capabilities and their own reasons for opposing French expansion. The fragmented political structure of the empire, with its numerous independent principalities and complex feudal relationships, offered opportunities for English diplomacy while simultaneously presenting challenges in terms of coordinating military activities and maintaining consistent alliance policies. The imperial court at Prague, where Emperor Louis IV maintained his residence, became a focal point for English diplomatic activities as Edward's representatives sought to secure formal recognition for their master's French claims. The alliance negotiations with German princes required substantial financial commitments from the English treasury, as these rulers demanded immediate payment for their military services rather than accepting promises of future rewards from successful campaigning. Edward's willingness to commit significant resources to these alliance arrangements demonstrated both his determination to pursue his French claims and his recognition that English military capabilities alone would prove insufficient against French power. The complexity of these financial arrangements, involving loans from Italian banking houses and advances against future customs revenues, created long-term obligations that would influence English fiscal policy throughout the subsequent conflict. The economic preparations for continental warfare required fundamental changes in English governmental finance and military organisation. The traditional feudal levy system, adequate for Scottish campaigns and domestic defence, proved unsuitable for the extended overseas operations that continental warfare would require. Edward's government implemented new taxation systems, including regular parliamentary grants and innovative customs arrangements, to generate the revenues necessary for maintaining professional armies in foreign territories. These financial innovations, while successful in supporting military operations, created political tensions with parliamentary representatives who demanded greater influence over governmental policy in exchange for their fiscal support. The development of English naval capabilities became essential as the conflict expanded beyond territorial disputes to encompass control over maritime trade routes and amphibious operations. The English fleet, traditionally composed primarily of requisition merchant vessels supplemented by a small number of purpose-built warships, required substantial expansion and improvement to challenge French naval dominance in the Channel and to protect English supply lines to continental allies. The construction of new warships at royal dockyards, including the innovative cog designs that would dominate medieval naval warfare, represented a significant investment in military technology that would prove crucial in subsequent naval engagements. The Battle of Sluys on June 24, 1340, provided Edward with his first major military victory of the French War and established English naval supremacy in the Channel that would persist throughout much of the subsequent conflict. The engagement occurred in the Zwin estuary near the Flemish coast, where a large French fleet had assembled to support planned invasion operations against England. The French naval force, commanded by Hugh Quiret and Nicolas Béhuchet, included both purpose-built warships and converted merchant vessels, representing one of the largest naval concentrations assembled during the medieval period. Edward's decision to engage the French fleet personally, commanding the English naval forces from his flagship the Thomas, demonstrated both tactical boldness and strategic understanding of the battle's importance for English war aims. The English fleet, organised into 3 divisions according to contemporary tactical doctrine, approached the French position in battle formation during the morning hours of June 24th. The king's presence at the battle's forefront provided crucial morale benefits for English sailors and soldiers, while ensuring unified command during the complex manoeuvring that characterised medieval naval combat. The tactical development of the battle revealed the effectiveness of English military innovations, particularly the coordination between archers and men-at-arms that had proven successful in Scottish warfare. The English ships, equipped with substantial numbers of longbowmen, maintained missile superiority throughout the engagement, while French reliance on traditional boarding tactics proved inadequate against well-coordinated defensive arrangements. The devastating casualties inflicted on French naval personnel, including the deaths of both French commanders, effectively eliminated French naval capabilities in the Channel and secured English control over crucial supply routes to continental allies. The strategic consequences of the Sluys victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical success to influence the broader trajectory of the Anglo-French conflict. English naval supremacy enabled the secure transport of armies to continental theatres of operation, while simultaneously protecting English coastal regions from French invasion attempts. The psychological impact of the victory, both in England and throughout Europe, established Edward's reputation as a formidable military commander and provided crucial momentum for his subsequent diplomatic and military initiatives in pursuing his French claims. The strategic situation facing Edward III in early 1346 required a fundamental reassessment of English military doctrine and operational planning. Following the inconclusive campaigns of the early 1340s, including the costly siege of Tournai and the diplomatic complexities of the Breton Succession War, Edward recognised that traditional approaches to continental warfare had failed to produce decisive results against French resistance. The king's military advisers, including experienced commanders like William Clinton, Earl of Huntingdon, and Thomas Hatfield, Bishop of Durham, advocated for a new strategic approach that would exploit French weaknesses while maximising English tactical advantages developed during the Scottish campaigns. The financial resources accumulated through parliamentary taxation and Flemish commercial partnerships provided Edward with unprecedented capabilities for mounting sustained military operations on the continent. The wool subsidy granted by Parliament in 1344 had generated substantial revenues, while the continuing alliance with Flemish cloth producers ensured steady income from customs duties and export licenses. These financial foundations enabled the recruitment of professional soldiers on a scale previously impossible for English monarchs, allowing Edward to assemble armies that could operate independently of feudal levy obligations and seasonal campaign limitations. The recruitment process for the 1346 campaign demonstrated the transformation of English military organisation from feudal service to professional warfare. Royal commissioners travelled throughout England, contracting with experienced soldiers who had served in previous Scottish and French campaigns. The system of indenture contracts, which specified terms of service, rates of pay, and equipment requirements, created a professional military class bound to the crown by financial rather than feudal obligations. These contracts typically required service for 1 year, providing Edward with forces capable of sustained operations while ensuring that the experienced soldiers received adequate compensation for extended overseas deployment. The assembly of the invasion force at Portsmouth during the spring of 1346 revealed the scale and sophistication of Edward's military preparations. The harbour, expanded through royal investment in dock facilities and supply warehouses, accommodated nearly 750 ships of various sizes, from large cogs capable of transporting horses and siege equipment to smaller vessels designed for rapid coastal operations. The logistical challenge of supplying this armada required careful coordination between royal officials, merchant contractors, and local authorities throughout southern England. Supplies included not only weapons and armour, but also foodstuffs, medical supplies, and the specialised equipment necessary for siege operations. The composition of Edward's army reflected the military innovations that would characterise the Crecy campaign. The traditional heavy cavalry, while still present in substantial numbers, no longer dominated English tactical thinking as it had during earlier medieval campaigns. Instead, Edward's commanders had developed integrated tactical systems that combined mounted men-at-arms, dismounted knights fighting as heavy infantry, and large numbers of longbowmen supported by Welsh spearmen and Irish kerns. This combined arms approach, refined through experience in Scottish warfare, provided tactical flexibility that would prove decisive against French reliance on traditional cavalry charges. The English longbow had evolved significantly since its introduction during the Welsh Wars of Edward II's reign. The weapons carried by Edward's archers in 1346 were typically 6 feet in length, constructed from seasoned yew wood that provided both flexibility and tremendous draw weight. Contemporary estimates suggest that experienced archers could achieve draw weights of 150 to 180 pounds, generating arrow velocities sufficient to penetrate most contemporary armour at ranges exceeding 200 yards. The bodkin points used against armoured opponents were specifically designed to concentrate impact force on minimal surface areas, allowing penetration of mail and even plate armour under optimal conditions. The tactical deployment of English archers had been revolutionised through careful study of battlefield experiences in Scotland and earlier French engagements. Rather than dispersing bowmen throughout the army or concentrating them in single large formations, English commanders had developed techniques for positioning archer units to provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining protection from cavalry attacks. The use of stakes and other field fortifications, combined with careful attention to terrain selection, created defensive positions that maximised archer effectiveness while minimising vulnerability to mounted assault. The departure from Portsmouth on July 11th, 1346, marked the beginning of the most ambitious English military operation since the Norman conquest. Edward's decision to command the expedition personally demonstrated both his confidence in the strategic plan and his recognition that royal presence was essential for maintaining army morale during extended continental operations. The king's household, including Queen Philippa and the royal children, remained in England under the protection of trusted officials, while Edward focused entirely on the military and diplomatic challenges of the coming campaign. The crossing to Normandy encountered favourable weather conditions that enabled the English fleet to maintain formation while avoiding French naval patrols that might have provided advance warning of the invasion. The selection of the Cotentin Peninsula as the landing site reflected careful strategic planning, as this region offered several advantages for English operations. The area's distance from major French military concentrations provided time for the army to organise and begin operations before facing serious opposition, while the peninsula's geography offered multiple options for subsequent strategic movements depending on French responses to the invasion. The landing at La Hogue on July 12, 1346, proceeded without significant French resistance, allowing Edward's forces to establish secure beachheads and begin the complex process of disembarking horses, equipment, and supplies. The absence of French opposition reflected both the surprise achieved by English strategic planning and the dispersed nature of French military resources, which were committed to various regional conflicts and could not be rapidly concentrated to oppose the invasion. The English army's rapid movement inland from the landing sites prevented French commanders from organising effective counterattacks during the vulnerable period immediately following the amphibious assault. The devastation of the Cotentin Peninsula during the first weeks of the campaign served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple economic warfare. The systematic destruction of French resources, including crops, livestock, and military supplies, denied these materials to potential French armies while simultaneously generating revenues for the English forces through organised plundering operations. The psychological impact of this devastation extended throughout northern France, as refugees fleeing English advances spread reports of the army's size and effectiveness, creating panic in regions far from the actual theatres of operation. Edward's march across Normandy toward the Seine demonstrated his army's remarkable mobility and logistical capabilities. The English forces covered approximately 200 miles in less than 3 weeks, maintaining formation discipline while conducting continuous operations against French strongpoints and supply centres. This operational tempo, unprecedented for medieval armies operating in hostile territory, reflected both the professional training of Edward's soldiers and the effectiveness of the logistical systems developed to support extended campaigning. The army's ability to maintain cohesion while conducting dispersed operations against multiple objectives simultaneously demonstrated the tactical sophistication that would prove decisive at Crécy. The Siege of Caen, beginning on July 26, 1346, provided Edward's forces with their first major test against significant French resistance. The city's fortifications, including substantial stone walls and a powerful castle, presented formidable obstacles to English assault operations. However, the speed of the English advance had prevented the garrison from adequately preparing defensive measures, while the civilian population's panic created additional complications for the French defenders. The successful storm of the city on July 26th demonstrated the effectiveness of English siege techniques and provided substantial quantities of supplies and equipment for the continuing campaign. The tactical innovations employed during the Siege of Caen included early experiments with gunpowder weapons that would become increasingly important in later medieval warfare. Contemporary chronicles describe the use of primitive cannons, probably small bombards capable of firing stone projectiles against fortifications. While these weapons remained relatively ineffective compared to traditional siege engines, their psychological impact on both defenders and civilian populations was considerable. The thunderous noise and smoke produced by gunpowder weapons created terror among those unfamiliar with such technology, contributing to the rapid collapse of French resistance. The march from Kurgan toward Paris required careful navigation through increasingly hostile territory as French military forces began to concentrate in response to the English advance. Philip VI's army, assembling in the region around Paris, represented the largest military force deployed by France during the early phases of the Hundred Years' War. Contemporary estimates suggest that the French army included more than 25,000 men, including substantial numbers of heavy cavalry, crossbowmen from Genoa, and infantry levies from throughout the kingdom. The concentration of such forces near the French capital created a formidable obstacle to Edward's strategic objectives, while simultaneously offering opportunities for decisive battle if favourable tactical conditions could be achieved. Edward's decision to advance toward Paris rather than consolidating English control over Normandy reflected both strategic boldness and careful calculation of French political vulnerabilities. The English king recognised that threatening the French capital would force Philip VI to commit his military resources to a major engagement, rather than pursuing the defensive strategies that had frustrated earlier English campaigns. The psychological impact of English forces operating within sight of Paris would demonstrate French military weakness to both domestic and international audiences, potentially undermining Philip's political authority, even if no decisive battle occurred. The crossing of the Seine at Poissy on August 16, 1346, represented one of the most technically challenging operations of the entire campaign. The destruction of existing bridges by French forces had created a significant obstacle to English movement, requiring the construction of temporary crossing points under hostile conditions. English engineers, working with materials salvaged from destroyed structures and timber cut from nearby forests, constructed a pontoon bridge capable of supporting the army's horses and equipment. The successful completion of this crossing, despite French attempts at interference, demonstrated the technical capabilities of Edward's military engineers and the army's ability to overcome major logistical obstacles. The retreat from the Seine toward the English Channel marked a fundamental shift in the campaign's strategic objectives. Edward's recognition that his army could not successfully assault Paris with the forces available required immediate adjustment of operational plans to avoid entrapment by superior French numbers. The withdrawal toward Flanders offered multiple strategic advantages, including potential reinforcement by Flemish allies and access to secure supply lines through English-controlled ports. However, the retreat also created tactical vulnerabilities, as French forces could potentially intercept the English army during river crossings or other constrained terrain. The search for a crossing point over the Somme River created the tactical conditions that would lead to the Battle of Crécy. French destruction of bridges and the positioning of garrison forces at major fords had effectively trapped Edward's army south of the river, while Philip VI's pursuing forces threatened to engage the English under unfavourable conditions. The discovery of the ford at Blanchetaque, revealed by a local prisoner under interrogation, provided the English army with a narrow window of opportunity to escape entrapment, while simultaneously offering possibilities for selecting favourable battle terrain on the north bank of the river. The crossing at Blanchetaque on August 24, 1346, required precise timing to take advantage of low tide conditions, while avoiding French forces positioned to contest the operation. The English vanguard, led by Hugh Despenser the Younger and Thomas Hatfield, engaged French defenders on both sides of the river, while the main army conducted the difficult crossing operation. The successful completion of this crossing placed Edward's forces in a position to select battle terrain, while French forces remained divided by the river obstacle, creating tactical opportunities that English commanders were prepared to exploit. The selection of the battlefield at Crécy-en-Ponthieu demonstrated Edward's sophisticated understanding of tactical terrain and defensive positioning. The ridge selected for the English position offered commanding views of the surrounding countryside, while providing natural obstacles to cavalry attacks. The slope of the ground favoured defensive operations, particularly for archer formations that could deliver plunging fire against advancing enemies. The positioning of the English army across the main road to Calais ensured that French forces would be compelled to attack the prepared English position rather than attempting to bypass it, creating the tactical conditions that English commanders preferred for decisive engagement. The organisation of the English battle line reflected years of tactical development and battlefield experience. Edward divided his army into three main divisions, with the vanguard commanded by his 16-year-old son Edward, the Black Prince, supported by experienced commanders including the Earls of Warwick and Oxford. The main battle remained under the king's personal command, while a reserve division provided tactical flexibility and security against potential flanking movements. This organisation allowed for coordinated tactical responses while ensuring that experienced leadership was available at all command levels. The positioning of English archers represented the culmination of tactical innovations developed throughout Edward's military career. Rather than concentrating bowmen in single large formations, the English commanders deployed archer units on the flanks of each division, creating overlapping fields of fire that would channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The use of field fortifications, including the famous stakes driven into the ground to impede cavalry charges, demonstrated the integration of engineering techniques with tactical doctrine. These preparations transformed the battlefield into a carefully constructed defensive system designed to maximise English advantages while neutralising French tactical strengths. The arrival of the French army on the evening of August 25, 1346, created the conditions for one of the most significant battles of the medieval period. Philip VI's forces, exhausted from their pursuit of the English army and disorganised by the rapid march from the Somme crossing, nevertheless represented formidable military capabilities. The French army included the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, experienced crossbowmen from Genoa under the command of Ottone Doria and Carlo Grimaldi, and substantial numbers of infantry levies from throughout the kingdom. The concentration of French nobility in the cavalry formations created both tactical strength and political vulnerability. as casualties among the aristocratic leadership would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate military situation. The tactical deployment of French forces revealed both the strengths and limitations of traditional medieval military doctrine. The positioning of Genoese crossbowmen in the vanguard reflected recognition of the importance of missile combat, while the massed cavalry formations behind them represented the traditional French reliance on mounted shock action. However, the coordination between these different tactical elements remained problematic as the crossbowmen and cavalry operated according to different tactical doctrines and command structures. The lack of unified tactical control would prove decisive during the battle's development, as French forces failed to coordinate their attacks effectively against the prepared English position. The aftermath of Crécy transformed Edward III from a successful military commander into a legendary figure whose reputation extended throughout Christian Europe. The devastating defeat inflicted upon French chivalry had shattered the myth of French military invincibility, while establishing England as a dominant force in continental warfare. Edward's return to England in October 1347, following the successful siege of Calais, provided him with the political capital necessary to implement ambitious domestic reforms and cultural innovations that would define his reign's mature phase. The king's vision extended beyond mere military conquest to encompass a comprehensive transformation of English court culture, centred around new concepts of chivalric honour and royal magnificence that would influence European aristocratic ideals for generations. The foundation of the Order of the Garter around 1348 represented the culmination of Edward's efforts to create a distinctly English chivalric institution that could rival the prestigious military orders of continental Europe. The precise circumstances surrounding the order's establishment remain shrouded in legend, with contemporary chronicles offering conflicting accounts of the specific events that inspired its creation. The most persistent tradition attributes the order's origins to an incident at a court ball where the Countess of Salisbury dropped her garter, prompting Edward to retrieve it and declare "Honi soit qui mal y pense" in response to courtiers snickering. While this romantic tale may contain elements of truth, the order's actual foundation reflected sophisticated political calculation rather than spontaneous chivalric gesture. The selection of Windsor Castle as the Order's headquarters demonstrated Edward's understanding of the symbolic importance of location in establishing institutional prestige. The castle's historical associations with English royal power, combined with its impressive architectural features and strategic position, provided an ideal setting for the elaborate ceremonies that would characterise Garter activities. The Round Tower, extensively renovated during Edward's reign, became the focal point of the Order's ritual life, its circular chamber deliberately evoking Arthurian associations, while providing practical space for the formal meetings and ceremonial functions that bound the knights together in fellowship. The Order's membership structure reflected careful attention to both domestic political requirements and international diplomatic opportunities. The initial complement of 26 knights, including Edward himself and his eldest son, created an exclusive brotherhood that encompassed the most prominent military leaders and noble families of the realm. The selection process emphasised demonstrated military prowess and personal loyalty to the crown, ensuring that membership represented genuine achievement rather than mere hereditary privilege. Knights were required to maintain high standards of personal conduct and military readiness, with specific obligations for service in royal campaigns and participation in the Order's ceremonial activities. The elaborate ritual and ceremonial framework developed for the Order of the Garter drew inspiration from both ecclesiastical traditions and secular chivalric practices. The annual feast day celebration on St. George's Day, April 23rd, became the centrepiece of the Order's calendar, featuring elaborate religious services, formal processions, and magnificent banquets that demonstrated the crown's wealth and cultural sophistication. The knights' distinctive blue robes, adorned with the Order's Garter emblem and motto, created visual unity while emphasizing the exclusive nature of membership. These ceremonial elements served multiple purposes, reinforcing bonds between members while providing spectacular displays of royal magnificence for domestic and foreign observers. The Order's patron saint, St. George, had particular significance for Edward's broader political and cultural programme. The warrior saint's legendary defeat of the dragon provided powerful symbolic resonance for a monarchy engaged in continental warfare against formidable enemies. The adoption of St. George as England's patron saint, formalised during Edward's reign, created national religious identity that complemented the military achievements of the French campaigns. The saint's feast day celebrations at Windsor became major events in the royal calendar, attracting visitors from throughout Europe and demonstrating England's emergence as a significant cultural centre. Edward's cultivation of Arthurian legend represented a sophisticated propaganda strategy designed to legitimise his reign while inspiring his nobility to embrace ideals of chivalric service. The Round Table tournaments held at Windsor during the 1340s and 1350s recreated legendary Camelot within the walls of a real royal residence, allowing participants to assume the roles of Arthur's knights while competing in elaborate martial displays. These events required substantial financial investment in costumes, decorations and prizes, but they generated enormous prestige for the English court, while attracting foreign nobles eager to participate in the legendary atmosphere. The physical reconstruction of Windsor Castle during this period created architectural settings appropriate for Edward's chivalric ambitions. The Great Hall received extensive renovations, including new timberwork decorated with heraldic devices and elaborate wall paintings depicting scenes from Arthurian romance. The Round Tower's interior was redesigned to accommodate formal meetings of the Garter Knights, with carved wooden stalls bearing individual heraldic achievements and space for the ceremonial objects that symbolised the Order's authority. These architectural improvements transformed Windsor from a primarily defensive structure into a palace suitable for the elaborate court ceremonies that characterised Edward's mature reign. The tournaments organised at Windsor represented the pinnacle of medieval martial entertainment, combining genuine military training with spectacular public display. The elaborate lists constructed within the castle's outer ward could accommodate thousands of spectators, while the complex rules governing competition ensured both safety and dramatic excitement. Knights from throughout Europe sought invitations to participate in these events, recognising that success in Edward's tournaments provided access to the most prestigious chivalric circle in Northern Europe. The king's personal participation in these competitions, despite the obvious risks to royal safety, demonstrated his commitment to the martial ideals he promoted among his nobility. The devastating impact of the Black Death, which reached England in the summer of 1348, created unprecedented challenges for Edward's government and fundamentally altered English society's structure. The plague, arriving through infected ships at Dorset ports, spread rapidly throughout the kingdom despite attempts at quarantine and isolation. Contemporary chroniclers described horrific scenes of mass mortality, with entire villages abandoned and urban populations decimated by the disease's relentless advance. The plague's indiscriminate nature, affecting all social classes regardless of wealth or status, created profound psychological trauma that complemented the immediate practical challenges of maintaining governmental functions amid demographic catastrophe. The mortality rates associated with the Black Death varied significantly across different regions and social groups, but contemporary estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population perished during the initial outbreak and subsequent recurrences. Rural areas, where agricultural labourers lived in close proximity and poor sanitary conditions, experienced particularly severe losses. Monastic communities, whose communal lifestyle and charitable obligations exposed them to infected visitors, suffered devastating casualties that disrupted religious life throughout the kingdom. urban centres, with their dense populations and extensive trade connections, became focal points for disease transmission, while simultaneously serving as refuges for rural survivors seeking economic opportunities. Edward's governmental response to the crisis demonstrated both the administrative capabilities developed during his reign and the limitations of medieval governmental authority when confronted with natural disasters of unprecedented scale. The Ordinance of Labourers, issued in June 1349, attempted to freeze wages and working conditions at pre-plague levels, recognising that labour shortages would otherwise create economic disruption throughout the kingdom. This legislation reflected sophisticated understanding of economic relationships, while revealing the Crown's determination to maintain social stability despite demographic catastrophe. However, enforcement proved extremely difficult as surviving workers recognised their enhanced bargaining power and demanded improved conditions. The administrative challenges created by the plague extended throughout all levels of government, from local manor courts to royal chancery operations. The death of experienced clerks, judges and administrative officials disrupted routine governmental functions while creating opportunities for advancement among survivors. The Crown's response included accelerated promotion procedures for qualified candidates and the recruitment of clergy to fill secular administrative positions. These expedient measures maintained governmental continuity while gradually transforming the personnel and culture of English administration. The economic consequences of the Black Death created both immediate crises and long-term opportunities for social transformation. Agricultural production declined dramatically as entire farming communities disappeared, leaving vast areas of cultivated land abandoned and unharvested. The disruption of established labour relationships forced landowners to offer improved terms to attract workers, gradually undermining the traditional manorial system that had dominated English rural life for centuries. Urban craft production similarly suffered from worker shortages, though surviving artisans benefited from reduced competition and increased demand for their services. The Crown's financial position initially deteriorated as tax revenues declined, along with population levels, but subsequent economic developments created new opportunities for royal income. The increased prosperity of surviving workers translated into enhanced consumption of luxury goods subject to royal taxation, while the concentration of wealth among fewer individuals simplified collection procedures. The wool trade, fundamental to English prosperity, recovered relatively quickly as Flemish demand remained strong despite reduced English production capacity. These economic adaptations demonstrated both the resilience of established commercial relationships and the flexibility of medieval economic structures when confronted with demographic shock. Edward's cultural and architectural patronage during the post-plague period reflected both personal interests and calculated political strategy. The continuation of major construction projects at Windsor Castle, despite economic disruption and labour shortages, demonstrated royal determination to maintain normal court life while providing employment opportunities for surviving craftsmen. The elaborate decorative schemes implemented during this period, including wall paintings, carved stonework and heraldic displays, created visual environments that reinforced royal authority while celebrating English military achievements and cultural sophistication. The promotion of English vernacular literature during Edward's reign represented a significant departure from the French-dominated literary culture that had characterised earlier medieval England. The king's patronage of English-language poets and chroniclers reflected both growing national consciousness and practical recognition that effective royal propaganda required communication in languages accessible to broad populations. The development of distinctly English literary traditions, while building upon continental models, created cultural products that celebrated specifically English achievements and values. The architectural innovations implemented at Windsor during the 1350s demonstrated the influence of continental Gothic styles adapted to English tastes and requirements. The reconstruction of St. George's Chapel, begun during this period, incorporated the latest developments in Perpendicular Gothic architecture, while providing appropriate settings for Garter ceremonies. The chapel's elaborate stone tracery, soaring vaults, and extensive glazed surfaces created interior spaces of remarkable beauty and acoustic quality. The integration of heraldic decoration throughout the architectural fabric celebrated the achievements of individual Gartier knights, while reinforcing the collective identity of the order. The manuscript illumination workshops established under royal patronage during this period produced some of the finest examples of medieval English art. The elaborate service books created for St. George's Chapel featured miniature paintings of exceptional quality, depicting both religious scenes and contemporary court activities. These manuscripts served practical liturgical functions while documenting the ceremonial life of Edward's court for posterity. The artistic techniques developed by these workshops influenced manuscript production throughout England, while establishing distinctly English approaches to decorative art. The musical patronage exercised by Edward's court contributed to significant developments in polyphonic composition and performance practice. The chapel choir established to serve St. George's Chapel attracted accomplished musicians from throughout Europe, creating a musical environment that fostered innovation and experimentation. The complex polyphonic masses composed for Garter ceremonies represented some of the most sophisticated musical achievements of the medieval period, combining technical excellence with dramatic effectiveness, appropriate to the elaborate ceremonial contexts in which they were performed. The diplomatic significance of Edward's chivalric innovations extended throughout European courts, where the Order of the Garter's prestige attracted attention and imitation. Foreign nobles sought membership in the order as recognition of their military achievements and political importance, while other monarchs established similar institutions in their own kingdoms. The cultural influence of Edward's court extended through these personal connections, spreading English approaches to chivalric ceremony and architectural decoration throughout the aristocratic networks that dominated European political life. The educational initiatives promoted during Edward's reign reflected both practical governmental needs and broader cultural ambitions. The establishment of schools for training administrative clerks ensured adequate supplies of qualified personnel for governmental service, while creating opportunities for social advancement among talented individuals from modest backgrounds. These educational programs emphasized practical skills including literacy, numeracy, and legal knowledge, but they also included instruction in classical literature and contemporary cultural achievements that prepared graduates for sophisticated court environments. The legal reforms implemented during the 1350s addressed both immediate problems created by the Black Death and longer-term issues of governmental efficiency and fairness. The expansion of royal court jurisdiction, while controversial among traditional local authorities, provided more consistent and predictable legal procedures for commercial disputes and property transfers. These reforms facilitated economic recovery while strengthening royal authority throughout the kingdom. The codification of customary practices and the standardization of legal procedures created foundations for future legal development while preserving traditional rights and privileges where possible. The emergence of Edward, Prince of Wales, as an independent military commander represented a fundamental shift in English strategic capabilities and marked the beginning of what would become one of the most celebrated military careers of the medieval period. Born at Woodstock Palace in June 1330, the prince had received his military education through direct participation in his father's campaigns, beginning with his nominal command of a division at Crecy when he was merely 16 years old. By the mid-1350s, however, the prince had developed into a formidable military leader in his own right, combining tactical innovation with strategic vision that would extend English influence throughout southwestern France in ways that purely defensive campaigns could never achieve. The prince's appointment as Lieutenant of Gascony in 1355 reflected both his proven military capabilities and Edward III's recognition that the French war required sustained operations conducted by commanders with sufficient authority to make independent strategic decisions. The traditional system of annual campaigns, constrained by seasonal weather patterns and the logistical challenges of maintaining armies across the Channel, had proven inadequate for achieving decisive results against French resistance. The establishment of a permanent English military presence in Gascony, under the command of a royal prince with access to substantial financial resources and recruitment capabilities, represented a revolutionary approach to continental warfare that would transform the nature of the Anglo-French conflict. The prince's arrival in Bordeaux in September 1355 initiated a period of intensive military preparation that would establish the foundations for his subsequent operational successes. The city, which had remained loyal to English rule despite periodic French pressure, provided an ideal base for expanded military operations throughout Aquitaine and beyond. The prince's household, which included experienced military commanders such as Sir John Chandos, Sir James Audley, and the Captal de Buch, represented a concentration of tactical expertise that could implement innovative battlefield techniques while adapting to the specific challenges of warfare in southwestern France. The strategic situation in Gascony required careful analysis of both French military capabilities and the political loyalties of local populations whose allegiances remained uncertain. The duchy's complex feudal structure, with its mixture of English-held territories, French-controlled strongpoints, and nominally independent lordships, created opportunities for diplomatic manoeuvring alongside military operations. The prince's early campaigns focused on consolidating English control over strategically important castles and towns, while demonstrating English military superiority to populations that might otherwise support French claims to regional authority. The chevauché strategy employed by the Black Prince represented a sophisticated approach to medieval warfare that combined economic warfare, psychological intimidation, and tactical flexibility in ways that traditional siege operations could not achieve. These rapid cavalry raids, typically involving forces of 2,000 to 6,000 men, could cover enormous distances while systematically destroying French resources and demonstrating the inability of French forces to protect their own territories. The devastation inflicted during these operations served multiple strategic purposes, denying resources to potential French armies while generating revenues through organised plundering that helped finance continued English military operations. The first major chevauché, launched from Bordeaux in October 1355, demonstrated the operational capabilities that the prince had developed during his initial months in Gascony. The English force, moving rapidly through the Armagnac and Toulouse regions, covered nearly 300 miles in 6 weeks, while avoiding major French concentrations that might have challenged their progress. The systematic destruction of crops, livestock, and military supplies created economic disruption throughout southwestern France, while establishing the prince's reputation as a commander capable of conducting operations deep within nominally French territory. The tactical innovations implemented during these operations reflected lessons learned from previous English campaigns while adapting to the specific requirements of warfare in southern France. The prince's forces typically advanced in multiple columns that could converge rapidly if threatened by French opposition, while maintaining sufficient dispersion to maximise the area of devastation inflicted during their passage. The integration of mounted men-at-arms, longbowmen and light cavalry created tactical flexibility that enabled effective responses to various forms of French resistance, from castle garrisons to hastily assembled feudal levies. The economic impact of these operations extended far beyond the immediate regions affected by English raids. The disruption of agricultural production and commercial activities created supply shortages throughout southern France, while the psychological effect of unchallenged English operations undermined confidence in French military capabilities among populations throughout the region. French attempts to organise defensive responses proved largely ineffective, as the speed and unpredictability of English movements prevented the concentration of adequate forces to challenge the prince's operations effectively. The diplomatic consequences of the prince's early successes created new opportunities for English alliance building throughout southwestern France. Local lords, witnessing the effectiveness of English military operations and the apparent inability of French forces to provide adequate protection, began to reconsider their political allegiances. The prince's careful attention to the treatment of prisoners and civilian populations, combined with his willingness to confirm traditional privileges and customs, created incentives for voluntary submission that complemented the intimidation effects of his military campaigns. The second major chevauchée, launched in August 1356, represented the culmination of the prince's strategic planning and would ultimately lead to the most significant English military victory since Crécy. The operational objectives extended beyond simple economic warfare to include the possibility of coordinating with other English forces operating in northern France, creating the potential for a comprehensive strategic offensive that might force decisive French responses. The prince's force, numbering approximately 7,000 men, represented one of the most capable military formations assembled by English commanders during the entire French war. The march northward from Bordeaux toward the Loire Valley required careful navigation through increasingly hostile territory, as French military forces began to concentrate in response to English movements. The prince's intelligence network, developed through previous operations and maintained through local contacts, provided crucial information about French dispositions while enabling the English force to avoid premature engagement with superior numbers. The systematic destruction continued throughout the march, with particular attention paid to military installations and supply centres that might support French defensive operations. The strategic situation facing the prince by early September 1356 had become increasingly complex as multiple French armies converged on his position. King John II of France, who had assumed personal command of the largest French military force assembled since Philip VI's defeat at Crécy, was advancing from the north with an army estimated at more than 16,000 men. Additional French forces under the Duke of Bourbon and other regional commanders were positioning themselves to prevent English withdrawal toward Gascony, creating the possibility that the prince's army might become trapped in central France without adequate supplies or reinforcement possibilities. The decision to accept battle near Poitiers reflected both strategic necessity and tactical confidence in English military capabilities. The prince's position south of the city offered several advantages, including favourable terrain for defensive operations and proximity to supply lines that could support extended operations if necessary. The ridge selected for the English position provided commanding views of the surrounding countryside while offering natural obstacles to cavalry attacks that had proven so effective in previous English victories. The careful positioning of the army demonstrated the tactical sophistication that the prince had developed through years of campaign experience. The Battle of Poitiers, fought on September 19, 1356, represented the culmination of tactical innovations developed throughout Edward III's reign, and established the Black Prince's reputation as one of medieval Europe's most capable military commanders. The English position, carefully selected to maximise defensive advantages while providing opportunities for counterattack, reflected sophisticated understanding of battlefield dynamics that had been refined through extensive campaign experience. The army's deployment in 3 main divisions, with substantial numbers of dismounted men-at-arms supported by longbowmen positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, created a defensive system capable of absorbing French attacks while maintaining tactical flexibility for offensive operations. The French army that advanced against the English position represented the flower of French chivalry, including King John II himself, his son Philip, and numerous dukes, counts, and other nobles whose participation demonstrated the battle's perceived importance for French royal authority. The French tactical approach relied heavily on traditional cavalry charges supported by crossbowmen and infantry levies, reflecting confidence in methods that had dominated European warfare for centuries. However, the French commanders had failed to adequately account for the tactical innovations that English forces had developed, particularly the devastating effectiveness of coordinated archery and the defensive capabilities of dismounted men-at-arms fighting from prepared positions. The battle's development revealed both the strengths and limitations of traditional French military doctrine when confronted with innovative English tactical systems. The initial French attacks, delivered with tremendous courage and determination, achieved limited success against the prepared English positions, but suffered devastating casualties from concentrated archery fire. The English longbowmen, positioned on the flanks of each division and protected by field fortifications, maintained sustained missile fire that disrupted French formations while inflicting severe casualties on both horses and riders. The effectiveness of English archery, demonstrated so dramatically at Crécy, proved equally decisive at Poitiers despite French attempts to develop countermeasures. The capture of King John II during the battle's climactic phase represented one of the most significant diplomatic coups in medieval European history. The French king, fighting with desperate courage as his army collapsed around him, was taken prisoner along with his son Philip and numerous other nobles whose ransoms would provide enormous financial benefits to English war efforts. The prince's personal involvement in the king's capture, documented by multiple contemporary sources, demonstrated both his tactical leadership and his understanding of the political significance of royal prisoners in medieval diplomatic negotiations. The immediate aftermath of Poitiers created unprecedented opportunities for English diplomacy, while simultaneously presenting complex challenges regarding the treatment of royal prisoners and the negotiation of peace terms. The prince's decision to treat King John with appropriate royal honours, despite his status as a prisoner, reflected both chivalric traditions and practical political calculation. The elaborate ceremonies conducted at Bordeaux following the army's return demonstrated English respect for French royal dignity, while emphasising the completeness of English military victory and the transformation of power relationships between the two kingdoms. The financial implications of the Poitiers victory extended far beyond the immediate ransoms demanded for royal and noble prisoners. The capture of King John II created opportunities for comprehensive peace negotiations that might resolve the fundamental issues underlying the Anglo-French conflict, including English claims to French royal authority and the status of English territories within France. The prince's careful management of these diplomatic opportunities, conducted in coordination with his father's government in England, demonstrated political sophistication that complemented his military achievements. The strategic consequences of Poitiers transformed the entire European political situation, as the capture of the French king created power vacuums throughout France that various regional authorities attempted to fill. The Dauphin Charles, serving as regent for his imprisoned father, lacked the military resources and political authority necessary to maintain effective central government control. Regional nobles, faced with the collapse of royal authority, began pursuing independent policies that further fragmented French resistance to English territorial ambitions. The negotiations leading to the Treaty of Bretigny began in earnest during 1359, as both sides recognised the need for comprehensive settlement of their territorial and dynastic disputes. Edward III's decision to launch a final major campaign toward Reims in 1359 to 1360, intended to secure his coronation as King of France, ultimately proved unsuccessful but provided crucial leverage for diplomatic negotiations. The failure of this campaign, due primarily to logistical challenges and French defensive strategies, convinced Edward that negotiated settlement offered better prospects than continued military operations. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed on May 8, 1360, represented the pinnacle of English success in the Hundred Years' War, and established territorial arrangements that would persist for more than a decade. The treaty's terms granted Edward III full sovereignty over an expanded Aquitaine that included Poitou, Saintonge, and other regions conquered during recent campaigns, while also confirming English control over Calais and its surrounding territories. In exchange, Edward formally renounced his claims to the French throne, though subsequent events would demonstrate the temporary nature of this diplomatic concession. The ransom arrangements for King John II, set at the enormous sum of 3 million gold écus, reflected both the unprecedented nature of capturing a reigning monarch and the English government's recognition of the financial opportunities created by their military successes. The payment schedule, spread over several years and secured by hostages including 2 of the French king's sons, created ongoing diplomatic relationships that would influence Anglo-French relations throughout the following decade. The complexity of these financial arrangements required sophisticated banking operations involving Italian merchant houses and created precedents for future diplomatic negotiations. The administrative challenges of governing the expanded English territories granted by the Treaty of Bretigny required fundamental changes in English governmental structures and colonial policies. The prince's appointment as Prince of Aquitaine, with sovereign authority over the enlarged duchy, created unprecedented opportunities for implementing innovative approaches to territorial administration. The establishment of English governmental institutions throughout the newly acquired territories required careful attention to local customs and legal traditions, while ensuring adequate revenue collection and military security. The development of colonial administrative structures in English-controlled France reflected both practical necessity and evolving concepts of territorial governance. The prince's court at Bordeaux became a major centre of governmental activity, attracting English administrators, merchants, and military personnel while simultaneously incorporating local nobles and officials who accepted English authority. The complex legal and cultural relationships created by this administrative fusion would influence English approaches to territorial governance for centuries and establish precedents for later colonial enterprises. The economic integration of English and French territories created new commercial opportunities while presenting significant challenges for traditional trading relationships. The wool trade, fundamental to English prosperity, required adaptation to new territorial configurations and political relationships. The prince's policies regarding commercial privileges and trading rights reflected sophisticated understanding of economic relationships, while demonstrating English commitment to maintaining the prosperity of territories under their control. The territorial gains secured by the Treaty of Bretigny fundamentally transformed the administrative and financial foundations of Edward III's government, creating unprecedented opportunities for domestic reform while simultaneously presenting complex challenges in managing vastly expanded territorial holdings. The enormous ransom payments flowing from France, combined with the enhanced customs revenues generated by expanded trade relationships, provided the English crown with financial resources that exceeded anything achieved by previous monarchs. These enhanced revenues enabled Edward to implement ambitious domestic policies while reducing dependence on parliamentary taxation that had historically constrained royal authority and created ongoing tensions between Crown and Commons. The evolution of parliamentary institutions during this period reflected both the Crown's enhanced financial position and the growing political sophistication of England's landed and commercial classes. The House of Commons, which had gradually assumed greater importance during the early phases of Edward's reign due to the Crown's need for tax grants to finance continental warfare, now found itself in a fundamentally altered relationship with royal authority. The reduced frequency of parliamentary sessions during the 1360s, made possible by alternative revenue sources, paradoxically strengthened the Commons' position when Parliament did convene, as representatives recognised their enhanced bargaining power and began asserting greater influence over governmental policies beyond simple fiscal matters. The composition of the House of Commons underwent significant changes during this period, as the economic disruptions caused by the Black Death created new patterns of wealth distribution and social mobility. The substantial reduction in England's population had concentrated landed wealth among fewer families while creating opportunities for commercial advancement among surviving merchants and craftsmen. These demographic changes translated into altered parliamentary representation as constituencies that had previously sent minor gentry or local officials to Westminster began electing members with substantial commercial interests and more sophisticated understanding of governmental finance and international trade relationships. The procedural innovations implemented during parliamentary sessions of the 1360s demonstrated the institution's growing administrative sophistication and its members' increasing familiarity with complex legislative processes. The development of formal committee structures, including specialized groups focused on taxation, legal reform, and commercial regulation, enabled more detailed examination of governmental proposals while providing opportunities for members to develop expertise in specific policy areas. These institutional developments created foundations for the expanded parliamentary authority that would characterise later periods of English constitutional development. The relationship between the House of Commons and the House of Lords evolved significantly during this period as both institutions adapted to changing political and economic circumstances. The devastating impact of the Black Death on noble families had reduced the Lords' membership while simultaneously concentrating political influence among surviving peers who had accumulated additional estates through inheritance and royal grants. The Commons' growing commercial expertise complemented the Lords' traditional focus on military and diplomatic affairs, creating opportunities for more effective coordination between the two houses on matters requiring both aristocratic authority and practical economic knowledge. Edward's approach to parliamentary management during the 1360s reflected sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics created by England's enhanced international position and domestic prosperity. Rather than attempting to dominate parliamentary proceedings through traditional methods of royal pressure and patronage, the king increasingly sought to build consensus through careful consultation and accommodation of legitimate parliamentary concerns. This approach, while requiring greater attention to political negotiation, ultimately strengthened royal authority by ensuring broad-based support for governmental policies while maintaining the appearance of constitutional governance that enhanced England's diplomatic reputation throughout Europe. The economic policies implemented during this period represented a comprehensive attempt to capitalise on England's military successes while building sustainable foundations for long-term prosperity. The currency reforms initiated in 1361 addressed persistent problems with monetary stability that had complicated both domestic commerce and international trade relationships. The introduction of new gold coinage, including the noble valued at 6 shillings 8 pence, provided stable currency for large commercial transactions while demonstrating England's enhanced economic status through the use of precious metals acquired through French ransom payments and territorial revenues. The regulation of England's wool export economy required careful balance between maximising royal revenues and maintaining the competitive position of English merchants in continental markets. The establishment of the Company of the Staple at Calais in 1363 created a monopolistic organisation that controlled the export of raw wool, while ensuring consistent quality standards and reliable supply arrangements for Flemish cloth producers. This institutional innovation generated substantial revenues for the Crown through licensing fees and export duties, while providing English merchants with enhanced bargaining power in negotiations with foreign buyers. The development of cloth production within England represented a strategic initiative designed to capture greater value from the kingdom's abundant wool supplies while reducing dependence on foreign manufacturing. Edward's government implemented policies encouraging Flemish weavers to establish operations in English towns, offering tax incentives and legal protections that attracted skilled craftsmen displaced by continental warfare. These immigration policies created new centres of cloth production in Norwich, Coventry and other English towns, while generating employment opportunities for English workers seeking alternatives to agricultural labour. The expansion of England's commercial relationships during this period extended far beyond traditional wool exports to encompass a diverse range of goods and services that reflected the kingdom's growing economic sophistication. The wine trade from English-controlled territories in France provided substantial revenues while creating new commercial relationships with merchants throughout northern Europe. The development of English shipping capabilities, supported by royal investment in port facilities and navigation improvements, enabled direct participation in Mediterranean trade routes that had previously been dominated by Italian merchant houses. Legal reforms implemented during the 1360s addressed both immediate problems created by demographic disruption and longer-term issues of administrative efficiency and judicial consistency. The establishment of justices of the peace represented a fundamental innovation in English legal administration, creating local officials with authority to handle minor criminal cases and administrative matters without requiring expensive and time-consuming referrals to higher courts. These appointments, typically drawn from the local gentry, provided the Crown with reliable representatives in rural areas, while offering advancement opportunities for families seeking enhanced social status. The expansion of royal justice during this period reflected both the Crown's enhanced administrative capabilities and growing demand for consistent legal procedures throughout the kingdom. The regular circuits conducted by royal judges brought standardized legal practices to regions that had previously relied primarily on local customs and manorial courts. These judicial innovations improved access to royal justice for ordinary subjects while strengthening central governmental authority through the systematic application of royal law in areas previously dominated by local authorities. The codification of legal procedures and the standardization of court practices created greater predictability in legal outcomes while reducing opportunities for corruption and arbitrary decision-making. The compilation of legal precedents and the distribution of standardized forms and procedures to local courts enhanced the efficiency of judicial administration while ensuring greater consistency in the application of royal law. These reforms established foundations for future legal development while preserving traditional rights and privileges where they did not conflict with royal authority. The management of England's nobility during this period required careful attention to both traditional feudal relationships and the new opportunities created by military success and territorial expansion. The distribution of war profits through grants of captured estates, ransom shares, and commercial privileges created powerful incentives for continued noble support, while ensuring that the benefits of military success extended throughout the aristocratic hierarchy. Edward's systematic approach to noble patronage maintained traditional hierarchies while rewarding merit and service in ways that encouraged continued loyalty and military effectiveness. Land grants in newly acquired French territories provided opportunities for establishing English noble families in continental holdings, while creating reliable administrative networks for governing conquered regions. These grants typically included both estates confiscated from French nobles and newly created lordships carved from royal domains, ensuring that recipients possessed both economic resources and political authority necessary for effective territorial control. The careful selection of grant recipients reflected attention to both military capabilities and administrative experience, ensuring that English territorial expansion would be supported by competent local governance. Marriage alliances arranged during this period served multiple political and diplomatic functions, while strengthening bonds between the Crown and noble families throughout England and its continental territories. The systematic arrangement of marriages between English nobles and members of prominent French families who had accepted English authority created networks of personal relationships that complemented formal political arrangements. These matrimonial policies facilitated cultural integration while ensuring that political loyalty would be reinforced through family connections extending across national boundaries. The distribution of commercial privileges and trading rights provided additional mechanisms for maintaining noble support while ensuring that aristocratic families could benefit from England's enhanced economic opportunities. Grants of market rights, toll exemptions and export licenses created ongoing revenue sources for noble families while integrating their economic interests with royal commercial policies. These arrangements ensured that the nobility possessed strong incentives for supporting governmental policies that maintained England's territorial gains and commercial advantages. The cultural developments fostered during this period reflected both England's enhanced international prestige and Edward's personal commitment to creating a sophisticated court environment that could rival the greatest centres of European civilization. The continued expansion of Windsor Castle included new residential quarters for noble visitors and diplomatic representatives, creating physical spaces appropriate for the elaborate ceremonial functions that characterised Edward's mature reign. The architectural innovations implemented during these construction projects incorporated the latest developments in Gothic design while maintaining distinctly English characteristics that emphasised national identity. The patronage of literary and artistic endeavours created cultural products that celebrated English achievements while contributing to broader European intellectual developments. The court's support for chroniclers and poets produced historical works that documented English military successes while placing them within broader narratives of chivalric achievement and royal authority. These literary works served both entertainment and propaganda functions, creating cultural artefacts that reinforced political messages while providing sophisticated entertainment for court audiences. The educational initiatives promoted during this period addressed both practical governmental needs and broader cultural ambitions that reflected England's enhanced international status. The expansion of educational opportunities for noble children included instruction in languages, mathematics, and legal studies that prepared them for administrative service, while ensuring cultural sophistication appropriate to their social positions. These educational programs created cadres of qualified administrators while maintaining traditional social hierarchies through selective access to advanced learning opportunities. The diplomatic innovations developed during the 1360s reflected England's transformation from a regional power to a major European authority capable of influencing continental political developments through both military and peaceful means. The establishment of permanent English diplomatic missions in major European capitals created ongoing intelligence networks while providing mechanisms for continuous political negotiation that complemented periodic military campaigns. These diplomatic innovations enabled more sophisticated foreign policy coordination while reducing dependence on expensive military solutions to international disputes. The financial administration developed during this period created governmental capabilities that would influence English fiscal policy for centuries. The integration of French territorial revenues with traditional English income sources required sophisticated accounting procedures and administrative coordination that pushed medieval governmental capabilities to their practical limits. The successful management of these complex financial arrangements demonstrated the administrative sophistication that Edward's government had achieved while creating precedents for future territorial expansion and colonial administration. The military innovations implemented during the 1360s reflected both the lessons learned from successful continental campaigns and the need to maintain defensive capabilities adequate for protecting England's expanded territorial holdings. The development of professional military units with specialised training and equipment created standing forces capable of rapid deployment to threatened regions, while maintaining the tactical flexibility that had proven so effective in previous campaigns. These military developments established foundations for the professional armies that would characterise later periods of English military history. The renewal of hostilities with France in 1369 marked the beginning of a dramatic reversal of English fortunes that would ultimately unravel most of the territorial gains achieved during Edward III's earlier campaigns. The catalyst for this renewed conflict emerged from the complex feudal relationships governing the Prince of Wales's administration of Aquitaine, where his attempts to impose new taxation systems to finance his Spanish campaigns had generated widespread resistance among Gascon nobles. These local grievances provided Charles V of France, who had assumed the throne in 1364 following his father's death in English captivity, with the legal pretext necessary to challenge English territorial holdings through judicial rather than purely military means. Charles V represented a fundamentally different adversary than the French kings Edward had previously faced. Where his predecessors had relied primarily on traditional feudal levies and the military prowess of French chivalry, Charles approached the conflict with systematic calculation and strategic patience that would prove devastatingly effective against English positions throughout France. His court at the Louvre had become a centre for military innovation and administrative reform, attracting capable commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin, and developing new tactical approaches specifically designed to neutralise the advantages that English armies had exploited so successfully at Crécy and Poitiers. The French king's decision to summon the Black Prince to appear before the Parliament of Paris in January 1369 to answer complaints from Gascon nobles represented a masterful exploitation of feudal law that placed Edward III in an impossible diplomatic position. As Prince of Aquitaine, Edward's son remained technically a vassal of the French crown for his continental territories, creating legal obligations that could be enforced through established judicial procedures. The prince's predictable refusal to acknowledge French judicial authority provided Charles V with the legal justification necessary to declare the duchy forfeit and to begin systematic military operations aimed at recovering territories that had been lost during the previous phase of the conflict. Edward III's response to this French challenge demonstrated both the strategic limitations created by England's extended territorial commitments and the king's own declining physical capabilities. The 60-year-old monarch, increasingly afflicted by what contemporary sources describe as recurring illness that may have been early symptoms of stroke, found himself unable to provide the dynamic military leadership that had characterized his earlier campaigns. The complex logistical requirements of defending scattered territories throughout France, from Calais in the north to Bordeaux in the southwest, exceeded England's available military resources while simultaneously preventing the concentration of forces necessary for decisive offensive operations. The French strategy, developed under Charles V's direction, represented a sophisticated understanding of English tactical strengths and strategic vulnerabilities that reflected careful analysis of previous English successes. Rather than seeking decisive battles where English longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms might repeat their earlier triumphs, French commanders adopted systematic approaches focused on siege warfare, economic disruption, and the gradual erosion of English territorial control through sustained pressure on isolated garrisons and supply lines. This methodical approach, while lacking the dramatic appeal of traditional chivalric warfare, proved remarkably effective against English positions that had been established during periods of French weakness and political instability. Bertrand du Guesclin's appointment as Constable of France in 1370 provided Charles V with a military commander whose tactical innovations and strategic vision would transform French military capabilities throughout the following decade. Du Guesclin, a minor Breton noble whose rise to prominence reflected merit rather than aristocratic birth, had developed expertise in guerrilla warfare and siege operations during the Breton succession conflicts of the 1350s and 1360s. His understanding of English tactical methods, gained through extensive combat experience against English forces, enabled him to develop countermeasures that neutralized many of the advantages that had previously ensured English battlefield superiority. The systematic French recovery of English territories began with carefully coordinated operations in Poitou and Saintonge, regions that had been granted to England under the Treaty of Bretigny, but remained geographically isolated from the main English strongholds in Gascony. French forces, operating under Du Guesclin's strategic direction, avoided direct confrontation with major English garrisons, while systematically capturing smaller castles and towns that provided logistical support for English territorial control. This methodical approach created cascading effects throughout English defensive networks, as the loss of minor positions compromised the security of major strongholds and forced English commanders to disperse their limited forces across increasingly untenable defensive perimeters. The Siege of Limoges in September 1370 provided a brutal demonstration of the changing character of the Anglo-French conflict and revealed the extent to which traditional chivalric conventions had been abandoned in favour of more ruthless approaches to territorial warfare. The city's surrender to French forces, following the defection of its bishop who had previously supported English rule, prompted a savage English response that shocked contemporary observers throughout Europe. The Black Prince's decision to storm the city and massacre its inhabitants, despite their attempts to surrender, reflected both his personal frustration with French successes and his recognition that terror tactics might prove necessary to maintain English control over increasingly rebellious populations. The massacre at Limoges marked a turning point in the prince's military career and personal reputation, as the brutal treatment of civilians contradicted the chivalric ideals that had previously defined his public image. Contemporary chroniclers, including Jean Froissart, documented the systematic killing of men, women and children during the sack of the city, creating accounts that would damage English diplomatic standing throughout Europe while providing French propagandists with powerful evidence of English brutality. The prince's deteriorating health, which may have contributed to his increasingly erratic decision-making, became apparent during this campaign as he required a litter to transport him between military operations. The financial costs of defending England's extended territorial commitments created mounting pressure on royal finances that could not be sustained through traditional revenue sources. The enormous ransoms collected following Poitiers had been largely exhausted by the late 1360s, while the territorial revenues from English-controlled French regions declined steadily as French military pressure disrupted normal economic activities. Edward's government found itself compelled to request increasingly frequent parliamentary subsidies to finance defensive operations, creating political tensions that had been largely absent during the prosperous years following the Treaty of Bretigny. The parliamentary sessions of the early 1370s revealed growing criticism of royal military policies and financial management that reflected both the deteriorating military situation and domestic concerns about governmental priorities. Members of the House of Commons, many of whom had prospered during the peaceful years of the 1360s, expressed scepticism about continued investment in expensive continental campaigns that appeared to offer diminishing returns. The traditional alliance between Crown and Parliament that had characterised Edward's earlier reign began to fracture as representatives demanded greater oversight of military expenditures and more detailed accounting of how tax revenues were being utilised. The military defeats suffered by English forces during the early 1370s demonstrated the effectiveness of French tactical innovations and the limitations of English military doctrine when confronted with systematic defensive strategies. The Battle of Pontvalon on December 4, 1370, resulted in a crushing defeat for an English force led by Sir Robert Knowles, one of Edward's most experienced military commanders. The engagement, fought in difficult terrain that negated English tactical advantages, saw French forces under Du Guesclin's command systematically destroy an English army through coordinated cavalry and infantry attacks that prevented the establishment of defensive positions that might have enabled effective archery deployment. The defeat at Pontvalon revealed fundamental problems with English military organisation that had developed during the prosperous years following Bretigny. The army's composition, which included substantial numbers of mercenary troops alongside traditional English levies, lacked the cohesion and tactical coordination that had characterised Edward's earlier forces. The mercenaries, primarily recruited from Gascon and German sources, possessed individual fighting skills but lacked familiarity with English tactical methods and demonstrated limited loyalty when confronted with determined opposition. The defeat resulted in the capture or death of most of the army's leadership, creating gaps in English military command structure that proved difficult to fill. The Battle of Cheysey in March 1373 provided additional evidence of French tactical superiority and English strategic confusion as the conflict entered its most difficult phase for English forces. The engagement occurred when an English relief force attempting to supply the besieged garrison of La Rochelle encountered a French army positioned to intercept their movements. The French commanders, implementing lessons learned from previous encounters with English forces, had selected terrain that prevented effective deployment of English longbowmen while providing advantages for cavalry operations. The resulting battle saw systematic destruction of English formations through coordinated attacks that exploited weaknesses in English defensive arrangements. The loss of La Rochelle following the defeat at Cheysey eliminated one of England's most important strategic positions on the French Atlantic coast, and demonstrated the cascading effects of military defeats on English territorial control. The port city had served as a crucial link between English holdings in Gascony and potential reinforcements from England, while its commercial activities had generated substantial revenues for English territorial administration. The city's fall to French forces created a gap in English defensive networks that compromised the security of remaining English positions throughout the region and forced fundamental reassessment of English strategic priorities. Edward's declining health became increasingly apparent during the mid-1370s, as the king struggled to maintain effective control over governmental operations while managing the complex challenges created by military reversals in France. Contemporary sources describe episodes of illness that left the king temporarily incapacitated and unable to participate in council meetings or ceremonial functions. These health problems, combined with the death of Queen Philippa in 1369, created a sense of governmental drift that was exacerbated by growing criticism of royal policies and mounting concerns about the succession. The increasing reliance on John of Gaunt, Edward's fourth son, for both military and political leadership reflected the practical necessities created by the king's declining capabilities and the Black Prince's deteriorating health. Gaunt's appointment to lead major military expeditions to France demonstrated his father's confidence in his abilities while simultaneously revealing the extent to which traditional royal authority had been delegated to younger members of the royal family. However, Gaunt's military campaigns, including his costly march from Calais to Bordeaux in 1373, achieved limited strategic success, while consuming substantial resources that England could ill afford to waste. The domestic political crisis that culminated in the Good Parliament of 1376 represented the most serious challenge to royal authority that Edward had faced since his seizure of power from his mother and Roger Mortimer in 1330. The Parliament, which convened in April 1376 and continued in session for 10 weeks, saw unprecedented criticism of royal financial management and demands for fundamental reforms in governmental administration. The House of Commons, led by Sir Peter de la Mare as its first recorded speaker, initiated impeachment proceedings against several royal officials while demanding detailed accounting of how tax revenues had been expended on military operations that had produced such disappointing results. The Parliament's criticism focused particularly on the influence of Alice Perrers, Edward's mistress, whose involvement in governmental affairs had generated widespread resentment among nobles and commons alike. Perrers, who had gained considerable wealth and influence through her relationship with the aging king, was accused of manipulating royal decisions for personal benefit while interfering with the proper administration of justice. The Parliament's demand for her banishment from court reflected broader concerns about the corruption of royal authority and the need for reforms that would restore effective governmental oversight. The impeachment of Lord Latimer, the King's Chamberlain, and other royal officials marked a significant expansion of parliamentary authority and established precedents for legislative oversight of royal administration that would influence English constitutional development for centuries. The detailed investigations conducted by parliamentary committees revealed extensive corruption in governmental departments, including the systematic embezzlement of funds intended for military operations and the sale of royal offices for personal profit. These revelations damage royal prestige while providing justification for increased parliamentary involvement in governmental administration. The financial crisis facing Edward's government by the mid-1370s reflected both the enormous costs of defending England's remaining French territories and the declining revenues available to support these operations. The loss of territorial income from conquered French regions, combined with the disruption of commercial activities caused by ongoing warfare, had eliminated many of the revenue sources that had supported royal finances during the prosperous 1360s. The government's increasing dependence on parliamentary taxation created political vulnerabilities that opposition groups were prepared to exploit through demands for greater oversight and reform. The military situation in France continued to deteriorate throughout 1375 and 1376, as French forces systematically reduced English territorial holdings to a few isolated strongholds that could be maintained only through enormous expense and constant reinforcement from England. The fall of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte in Normandy eliminated England's last significant position in that region, while the loss of numerous castles in Poitou and Saintonge reduced English territorial control to scattered enclaves that possessed little strategic value. By 1377, English holdings in France had been reduced to Calais, Bordeaux, and a few surrounding territories that represented a fraction of the extensive domains controlled at the height of English success. The death of the Black Prince on June 8, 1376, removed Edward's most capable military commander and created succession uncertainties that further complicated England's strategic position. The prince's death, following years of declining health that may have resulted from dysentery contracted during his Spanish campaigns, eliminated the most experienced English commander familiar with French territorial conditions and military capabilities. His son Richard, born in 1367, was too young to assume military responsibilities, creating a succession crisis that would influence English politics for decades, while simultaneously removing effective military leadership during a critical period of the conflict. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken during 1375 and 1376 reflected English recognition that military solutions alone could not restore the territorial position that had been achieved during the 1360s. The negotiations conducted through papal mediation sought to establish truces that might preserve England's remaining territorial holdings, while providing opportunities for diplomatic resolution of outstanding disputes. However, these diplomatic efforts achieved limited success as Charles V recognised his military advantages and saw little incentive to make significant concessions that would restore English territorial control. The impact of ongoing military failures on English domestic politics extended beyond immediate financial concerns to encompass broader questions about royal authority and governmental competence. The contrast between Edward's earlier military successes and the systematic defeats of the 1370s created political vulnerabilities that opposition groups were prepared to exploit through parliamentary criticism and demands for reform. The king's declining health and obvious inability to provide effective military leadership further undermined royal authority, while creating opportunities for enhanced parliamentary influence over governmental policies. The final months of Edward III's life unfolded against a backdrop of military reversals, political upheaval, and personal decline that stood in stark contrast to the triumphant decades that had defined his mature reign. By early 1377, the once mighty king who had humbled French chivalry at Crécy and Poitiers found himself presiding over a kingdom burdened by the costs of defending rapidly shrinking continental territories while facing unprecedented domestic criticism of royal policies and financial management. The physical deterioration that had become increasingly apparent since the mid-1370s now confined Edward to his private chambers at Sheen Palace for extended periods, leaving the practical business of government to his surviving sons and a council dominated by figures whose competence and loyalty were increasingly questioned by parliamentary representatives. The king's final public appearance occurred during the Easter celebrations of 1377 at Windsor Castle, where the annual Garter ceremonies proceeded with traditional magnificence despite the political tensions surrounding the court. Contemporary observers noted Edward's obvious frailty as he was assisted through the elaborate rituals that had once showcased his personal charisma and royal authority. The contrast between the ageing monarch, supported by attendants and struggling to maintain his composure during lengthy ceremonial procedures, and the vibrant warrior king who had personally led charges at Halidon Hill and commanded fleets at Sluys, provided a poignant reminder of mortality's triumph over even the most successful medieval rulers. The succession arrangements that would govern England's transition to new leadership had been fundamentally complicated by the Black Prince's death in June 1376, which elevated his 10-year-old son Richard to the position of heir apparent, while creating uncertainties about regency arrangements and governmental continuity. The complex relationship between John of Gaunt, whose military and political prominence made him the de facto head of royal government, and the parliamentary opposition that had emerged during the Good Parliament of 1376, created potential for constitutional crisis that threatened to undermine royal authority during the vulnerable transition period following Edward's eventual death. The diplomatic isolation that characterised England's international position by 1377 reflected both the military reversals in France and the broader European perception that English power was in irreversible decline. The alliance networks that Edward had carefully constructed during the 1340s and 1350s had largely collapsed as continental partners reassessed their relationships with a kingdom that could no longer provide effective military support or attractive commercial opportunities. The Flemish cities that had been crucial allies during the early phases of the Hundred Years' War now maintained increasingly independent policies that reflected their recognition of French military resurgence and English weakness. The financial crisis facing the English government had reached critical proportions by early 1377, with royal revenues insufficient to meet even basic governmental obligations, while the costs of maintaining garrisons in France's remaining English territories continued to drain resources that might otherwise have supported domestic priorities. The parliamentary subsidies granted during the 1370s had proven inadequate to address the fundamental structural problems created by the loss of French territorial revenues and the disruption of commercial activities that had previously supported royal finances. The government's increasing reliance on loans from Italian banking houses and advances against future customs revenues created debt obligations that would constrain royal policy for decades. Edward III died on June 21, 1377 at Sheen Palace, attended only by a small group of household servants and clergy after his sons and most courtiers had departed, apparently believing the king's condition had stabilised. The circumstances surrounding his death, with Alice Perrers reportedly stealing rings from his fingers before fleeing the palace, provided the undignified conclusion to a reign that had begun with such promise and achieved such remarkable heights. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to reconcile the image of the abandoned king dying alone with memories of the triumphant monarch who had dominated European politics for nearly half a century. The immediate succession crisis that followed Edward's death demonstrated the extent to which English governmental structures had become dependent on effective royal leadership, while revealing the constitutional uncertainties created by a child king's accession during a period of military and financial crisis. The coronation of 10-year-old Richard II on July 16, 1377, at Westminster Abbey, proceeded according to traditional ceremonies, but the elaborate rituals could not disguise the fundamental challenges facing a kingdom governed by regency arrangements during one of the most difficult periods in medieval English history. The assessment of Edward III's 50-year reign reveals a monarch whose achievements fundamentally transformed both England's international position and its domestic constitutional development, though the ultimate sustainability of these changes remained questionable by the time of his death. The military innovations pioneered during his campaigns, particularly the tactical integration of longbowmen with dismounted men-at-arms and the development of professional military organisations, revolutionised medieval warfare and established England as Europe's preeminent military power for several decades. The devastating effectiveness of English armies at Crécy, Poitiers, and numerous smaller engagements demonstrated the superiority of coordinated, combined arms tactics over traditional cavalry-dominated approaches that had previously characterised European military practice. The constitutional developments that occurred during Edward's reign, including the expansion of parliamentary authority and the establishment of regular consultation between Crown and representatives, created institutional foundations that would influence English governmental development for centuries. The House of Commons, which had emerged as a significant political force during the early phases of Edward's reign due to royal financial needs, had evolved into a sophisticated legislative body, capable of detailed oversight of governmental policies and effective resistance to royal initiatives that conflicted with broader national interests. The impeachment procedures developed during the Good Parliament of 1376 established precedents for parliamentary control over royal officials that would become fundamental elements of English constitutional practice. The impact of Edward's reign on English national identity proved equally transformative, as the military successes achieved against France and Scotland created unprecedented levels of national pride and cultural confidence that transcended traditional regional and social divisions. The development of distinctly English approaches to chivalric culture, exemplified by the Order of the Garter and the Arthurian ceremonies at Windsor Castle, provided cultural frameworks that celebrated English achievements while distinguishing English aristocratic ideals from continental models. The promotion of English vernacular literature and the patronage of English artists and craftsmen created cultural products that reinforced national identity, while demonstrating England's emergence as a major European cultural centre. The long-term consequences of the 100 Years' War, for both England and France, extended far beyond the immediate territorial and political changes achieved during Edward's lifetime to encompass fundamental transformations in governmental structures, military organisations, and economic relationships that would influence both kingdoms for centuries. The financial pressures created by sustained warfare had forced both monarchies to develop more sophisticated taxation systems and administrative structures, while the military requirements of continental campaigning had accelerated the development of professional armies and innovative tactical doctrines that revolutionised European military practice. For England, the war's economic impact proved paradoxical, as the enormous costs of military operations and territorial administration ultimately outweighed the financial benefits derived from ransoms, territorial revenues, and commercial opportunities. The wool trade, which had provided crucial revenues during the early phases of the conflict, faced increasing competition from continental cloth producers, while the disruption of traditional trading relationships created economic instability that persisted long after military operations had concluded. The demographic impact of the Black Death, combined with the military casualties suffered during extended campaigning, created labour shortages and social disruptions that fundamentally altered English economic structures and social relationships. For France, the war's consequences included both devastating short-term destruction and ultimately beneficial long-term developments that strengthened royal authority and national unity. The systematic devastation inflicted by English chevauchés had destroyed vast areas of agricultural production and eliminated entire communities, creating economic disruption that required decades to repair. However, the military pressures created by English occupation had also forced French kings to develop more effective governmental institutions and military organisations, while fostering national consciousness that transcended traditional regional loyalties and feudal obligations. The military innovations developed during Edward's campaigns influenced European warfare for centuries. as the tactical principles demonstrated at Crécy and Poitiers were adopted and adapted by military commanders throughout the continent. The integration of missile weapons with heavy infantry, the systematic use of field fortifications, and the coordination of different military arms became standard elements of military doctrine that persisted through the gunpowder revolution and into the early modern period. The professional military organisations developed to support English territorial ambitions provided models for the standing armies that would dominate European warfare during subsequent centuries. The social transformation accelerated by the war's economic and demographic impacts created new patterns of wealth distribution and social mobility that fundamentally altered traditional hierarchical relationships throughout both kingdoms. In England, the concentration of wealth among surviving noble families, combined with new opportunities for commercial advancement among merchants and craftsmen, created more fluid social structures that enabled greater mobility between traditional class boundaries. The military service opportunities provided by extended campaigning allowed individuals of modest origins to achieve wealth and status through demonstrated competence and courage, creating precedents for merit-based advancement that would influence English social development for generations. The cultural achievements fostered during Edward's reign established England as a major centre of artistic and intellectual activity that could compete with the most sophisticated courts of continental Europe. The architectural innovations implemented at Windsor Castle and other royal residences demonstrated English mastery of contemporary Gothic styles, while incorporating distinctly national elements that celebrated English achievements and cultural identity. The manuscript illumination workshops and musical establishments maintained under royal patronage produced artistic works of exceptional quality that influenced cultural development throughout Northern Europe while establishing distinctly English approaches to decorative arts. The diplomatic legacy of Edward's reign included both the precedents established for international negotiation and alliance building, and the long-term consequences of territorial claims and dynastic disputes that would influence European politics for generations. The Treaty of Bretigny had demonstrated the possibility of comprehensive territorial settlements that could resolve complex feudal disputes, though the subsequent breakdown of these arrangements revealed the difficulties of maintaining negotiated solutions without continuing military pressure. The English claims to French royal authority, while ultimately unsuccessful, established precedents for dynastic warfare that would influence European succession disputes throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Historical evaluation of Edward III among medieval English monarchs consistently places him among the most successful rulers of the period, though scholarly assessment has evolved significantly as historians have gained greater appreciation for the long-term costs and consequences of his military achievements. Contemporary chroniclers, writing during or shortly after Edward's reign, typically emphasised his military victories and chivalric qualities, while minimising the financial and social costs of his policies. Modern historians, with access to more comprehensive administrative records and greater understanding of medieval economic relationships, have developed more nuanced assessments that recognise both Edward's remarkable achievements and the ultimate unsustainability of his territorial ambitions. The influence of Edward's reign on subsequent English kingship proved profound and lasting, as later monarchs sought to emulate his military successes while learning from his strategic mistakes. The model of warrior kingship that Edward embodied, combining personal military leadership with sophisticated diplomatic manoeuvring and domestic political management, became the standard against which future kings would be measured. However, the financial and constitutional constraints created by Edward's policies also limited the options available to his successors, who inherited both the expectations generated by his achievements and the practical limitations created by England's reduced resources and enhanced parliamentary authority. The transformation of England from a relatively minor European kingdom to a major continental power during Edward's reign represented one of the most remarkable political developments of the medieval period, though the ultimate failure to maintain these achievements demonstrated the limitations of medieval military and administrative capabilities when confronted with the challenges of governing extensive territorial holdings. The kingdom that Edward bequeathed to his grandson possessed enhanced international prestige, more sophisticated governmental institutions, and greater cultural confidence. But it also faced unprecedented financial obligations, constitutional uncertainties, and military challenges that would test English political stability for decades. Edward III's reign thus stands as both the pinnacle of medieval English achievement and a cautionary tale about the limits of military conquest as a foundation for lasting political transformation. His 50 years on the throne witnessed England's emergence as Europe's dominant military power and the development of governmental and cultural institutions that would influence English development for centuries. Yet, the ultimate failure to maintain the territorial gains achieved at such enormous cost, combined with the domestic political crisis that characterised his final years, demonstrated that even the most successful medieval rulers remained subject to the fundamental constraints of their historical circumstances. The legacy of Edward III would inspire English ambitions for generations, while serving as a reminder of both the possibilities and limitations inherent in medieval kingship.